She walked 40 miles through the Montana dark with a bleeding hand and a dead man's letter and one name she had never spoken aloud. The man on the other side of that door had been waiting 11 years to owe nobody anything. She knocked anyway. 3 times. The knock of a woman who had already decided she was not leaving. Inside, a chair scraped. Boots hit the floor. The kind of heavy, unhurried footsteps that belong to a man who has decided in advance what his face is going to do when he opens the door. The door swung open. Somewhere south of them, in a valley where the biggest house threw the longest shadow, a rider was already saddling a fast horse. He had a letter of his own, and his letters always got answered. The afternoon was dying slow over the high country, the way Montana afternoons died in August, not all at once, but piece by piece, the light pulling back from the rock faces first, then the scrub pine ridgeline, then finally surrendering the flats below to a color somewhere between rust and old blood. Ruth Granger had been walking since before dawn. 2 days of it, 40 miles of it. Her boots had spoken to her in blisters since somewhere around the 18-mile mark, and she had stopped listening to them around mile 25 because there was nothing useful they had to say. She stood at the top of the last switchback and looked down at Stone Ridge Ranch, the way a person looks at a thing they have been told about for years and are only now seeing with their own eyes and finding it both exactly right and nothing like what they imagined. The cabin sat low against the slope, built from timber that had grayed to the color of weathered bone. The chuangua behind it was bigger than the cabin needed to be for one man, which told her something. The fence line ran out past where Practical stopped and kept going, the kind of fence a person builds when they need their hands occupied more than they need the fence. There was a paddock to the east with a single horse moving along the far rail, a dark animal, big-shouldered, restless in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. Everything about the place said, a man lives here alone and has arranged things precisely so. Ruth shifted the canvas bag on her shoulder. Light. Too light for a whole life, but she had not been able to carry the whole life. She had carried what mattered. The letter folded so many times the creases had gone white as bone. Clean clothes rolled tight. Her mother's small sewing kit with the ivory handle because she had grabbed it without thinking and had not put it back. Her left hand was wrapped in a strip torn from her second-best petticoat. The fabric darkened where the blister had opened sometime in the last hour. Her right hand was fine. Her right hand was holding the letter, and she had been careful about that. The walk down the switchback took another 20 minutes. The light kept retreating. By the time she reached the flat ground in front of the cabin and crossed the packed earth of the yard, the sky behind the peaks had gone the color of a bruise healing wrong, purple pressing into orange, pressing into the gray that always came before dark in the high country. She did not stop at the edge of the yard. Stopping would have given her courage time to consult the part of her brain that was already running the numbers and coming up short. She walked to the door and she knocked. 3 times. Solid. The knock of a woman who had walked 40 miles and was not going to be mistaken for someone uncertain. Nothing. Then the boots on a plank floor, heavy, unhurried. The footsteps of a man who had decided before he reached the door what his face was going to look like when he opened it. The door swung inward. He filled the frame the way a door frame gets filled when someone was built for outdoor work over a long number of years. Tall, wide through the shoulders in the way that comes from actual labor and not from vanity. His flannel shirt was the color of dark timber, the sleeves rolled to the forearm. Suspenders the brown of saddle leather. He was not wearing his hat, and his hair was the color of pine bark in wet weather, and his eyes were the particular gray of a sky that has not decided yet whether it intends to rain. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment that was 3 heartbeats long by her count, though she was aware that her heart was not operating at its normal rhythm. Then he started to close the door. Ruth put her left hand in the gap, the bandaged one, the one that hurt, and she felt the edge of the door frame against the wrapped cloth and she did not move it. My father is gone. The words came out level. She had practiced them for 40 miles and they came out the way she had practiced them, which was without the waver she had been afraid would be there. You are the only one I have left. He looked at her hand in the gap, then at her face. Something shifted in the gray eyes, not softness exactly, not sympathy, something more careful than that. The door did not close. Did he send you with anything besides a name? Ruth reached into the front of her coat with her right hand, the good hand, and drew out the letter. She held it up between two fingers. The white creases of it caught what was left of the light. He said to tell you something first, before you read it. He said you would try to find a reason to close the door, and he said to give you these two words before you could. Holt Calloway stood in the doorway of the only home he had allowed himself in 11 years and waited. Dry Fork River. The change that moved through him was not dramatic. It was not the kind of thing a person watching from outside would have necessarily seen. It was internal, the way a structural thing shifts, not collapse, but the infinitesimal settling that happens when something load-bearing takes on more weight than the architecture was expecting. His hand came off the doorframe. You had best come inside. His voice said that. The rest of him said he was going to spend the next several hours resenting the fact. The inside of the cabin was exactly what the outside had prepared her for, which was the home of a man who had pared his life down to what was functional and had not added anything decorative since the paring. One table solid, scarred from use, positioned near the single window for light. 2 chairs, but only one of them was the good chair. The other was a working chair, the kind pulled out for mending harness or cleaning a rifle, not for sitting in by choice. A shelf of books arranged with a precision that suggested a man who needed at least one thing in his life to stay where he put it. A wood stove with a coffee pot on it that had been on it for some time, judging by the particular quality of the smell. On the shelf, beside a Bible that had seen considerable use, there was a woman's hat. Small, the kind worn pinned at an angle. The ribbon faded from whatever color it had started as into a pale suggestion of itself. It was not decorative. It was not on display. It was just there, and it did not fit with anything else on the shelf. And Ruth looked at it for one moment and then looked away, because some things in other people's homes you do not look at directly. Sit, he said, the good chair. She sat. He did not sit. He stood, because that was the arrangement the room seemed to require him standing, her seated. Two strangers having a conversation that neither of them had chosen in a location that belonged entirely to him. Tell me your name. Ruth Granger. My father was Silas Granger. What did Silas Granger do for work? He trained horses and he kept books for men who owned horses. He was good at both. He never got rich at either. She kept her hands enfolded in her lap. The bandaged one was starting to remind her it existed. That is the whole of his professional life in 2 sentences, if you wanted it short. How did he know my name? He knew it because he gave you it. Or he gave you back the use of it, which amounts to the same thing. She met his eyes. He was still doing the careful thing with his face, not giving her anything she could read for certain. Dry Fork River was 9 years ago. You had a bullet in your side and your horse had died on top of your legs, and he said you looked at him when he found you and said one word. Just one. He said you asked him why, and he said he never had a good answer except that he couldn't ride past. Holt Calloway looked at the wall to his left and not at her. The muscle along his jaw did a thing that was not quite movement and not quite stillness. He said, after he got you to the doctor, after he left you on that porch, he looked back once. He said you had just come around enough to sit up and you didn't know he was still watching. He said you took your hat off. Ruth kept her voice even. Just to the empty morning. Like you were thanking someone. He said a man does that when he doesn't have to and doesn't know anyone is watching. That is a man you can trust. He said he remembered it for 9 years. I don't recall that. He said you wouldn't. He recalled it for you. A long pause. The coffee pot made a sound on the stove. The wind found a gap somewhere in the chinking above the door and moved through it briefly and stopped. Your father is dead, Holt said. 3 weeks ago. How fever. It came in February and it stayed. The doctoring cost more than we had and then more than we could borrow, and there was a man in the valley who was glad to lend what was needed. She looked at her folded hands. Glad the way a spider is glad when something lands in the right part of the web. The name was right there, ready, and she watched him understand that there was a name coming. Edmund Voss. Holt said nothing. He owns the largest spread in 3 counties. He owns the men who wear badges in 2 of those counties, and he dines with the judge in the 3rd. When my father died, the note on the loan came due. I could not pay it. Voss came to the house, our house, the house my father built, and he was very polite about it. He tipped his hat. He said a debt was a debt, and the law was the law, and there were arrangements that could be made. Ruth kept her voice level the way she had kept her voice level for 3 weeks, by something that was more like applied will than actual calm. He said he knew of a widower who needed a companion. He said he admired a woman with character. The standing quality of Holt in the room changed. Not movement. Just a change in how still he was holding himself. The particular stillness of a man who is holding something in place that would rather move. I left that night. I took the one thing he could not put a price on, which was my father's word written down, and I walked north. I did not stop walking until I got here. Holt crossed to the stove. He took 2 cups from the shelf, both plain tin, no ceremony to them, and poured coffee into each. He set one on the table in front of her and kept one in his own hand and stood with the stove at his back. Your father wants me to marry you. Yes. No. Not cruel. Not even cold exactly. The word had the quality of something he had thought through before she finished explaining. No woman arrives at the home of a man she has never met and marries him on account of a debt to her dead father. That is not paying a debt. That is the waste of a life, hers, mostly, and mine somewhat. He looked at her over the rim of the tin cup. I have money put aside. Not a great sum, but sufficient. I have horses. I will give you the best one I own. You can get yourself back to a town that is not in the shadow of this Voss, and you can start over with an honest stake. That is what I can offer you, and it is an honest offer. Ruth looked at him for a moment. Then she said, It is an honest offer, and I appreciate it, and it will not work. Why? Because money runs out, and a horse can be taken, and a woman alone, with no name that means anything to anyone in a county she doesn't know, is not starting over. She is just waiting longer for the same ending. She kept her eyes on his. I did not walk 40 miles because I was afraid to be alone, Mr. Calloway. I have been alone. Alone I can manage. I walked 40 miles because there is a man who has decided I am collateral on a debt, and who owns the legal machinery of 3 counties, and who will find me wherever I go, until he has collected what he has decided he is owed. Money does not stop that man. A horse does not stop that man. What stops him? A name on a marriage record that makes me the legal property of someone else. Not property in truth in law. The way his law works, a married woman cannot be collected on a dead man's debt. The very legal structure he uses to take what he wants from people, that same structure becomes a wall, if I am standing on the right side of it. She lifted the tin cup and drank the coffee, which was terrible, and which she was grateful for, because she needed something to do with her hands. I am not asking you to love me. I want to be very clear on that, because I think you are the kind of man who would hear the word marry and think I was asking for something I am not asking for. I am asking you to be a wall. That is the entire request. Holt Calloway set his cup down on the shelf beside the woman's hat, and he looked at her the way a man looks at weather coming across a ridge he knows well, not afraid of it, not glad of it, just reading it accurately. How old are you? 27. When did your mother pass? Something moved in her face. When I was 11. Fever then too. She straightened it back out. It appears to run in my family, being reduced to one person and then none. You said you kept books. My father taught me. I am better at it than he was, which I say not to speak ill of him, but because it is accurate, and because I think you may need to understand what I am actually offering. Anyone can add numbers. I can find what the numbers are trying not to say. She looked around the single room of his cabin, at the shelf, at the books, at the stove, at the hinge on the window that needed attention and had needed it for some time. I can also train horses. Not as well as my father, but well enough that I am not lying to you when I say it. You can tell all of that from sitting in my kitchen for 10 minutes. I can tell that hinge has been loose for at least 1 winter by the rust pattern on the bolt, that you have not had your books kept by anyone who knows what they are doing, because a man who did would not have a gap in his fence line that is costing him at least 2 hours of work every week to compensate for, and that the horse in your east paddock is not mean, it is afraid. And the distinction matters considerably to the horse, even if it has not mattered to anyone else. She picked up the cup again. Those are the things I can see from the table. I have not been in the rest of the building. Silence. The kind that is not uncomfortable so much as it is weight-bearing. Go up the loft ladder, Holt said at last. There are blankets in the chest. Sleep. We'll talk in the morning. You haven't given me an answer. The answer in the morning will be better than the answer right now. Right now the answer is no, and in the morning it might still be no, but it will be a no that has thought itself through, and I owe you that much at least, given that you walked 40 miles to hear it. He moved to the stove to bank the fire for the night. When did you eat last? She did not answer, and he turned and looked at her. Yesterday morning, she said. I had some dried meat at noon yesterday, and then I ran out. He went to the shelf and brought out cold biscuits and leftover beans in a cast-iron pot and set them on the stove to warm, without saying anything about it. He poured her more of the terrible coffee and set it near her hand. Then he turned his back and busied himself with the fire and let her eat. She ate 4 measured bites before she stopped measuring. She was not going to be embarrassed about it. She had walked 40 miles. She had done what needed to be done to get here, and hunger was a fact and not a failing, and she was going to eat and not apologize for it, and that was that. By the 5th bite she was not measuring anything. By the 8th she had finished what was on the plate, and her eyes had moved to what was remaining in the pot, and she looked up to find that Holt had his back to her, was doing something with the woodpile that did not need doing, was giving her the room to be hungry without being watched, being hungry. She thought, he has been alone a long time, but he has not forgotten how to be decent. She thought, that is either a very good sign or a very dangerous one. After she had eaten and the plate was empty and she had wrapped both hands around the tin cup for the warmth of it, Holt said, not turning around, you didn't ask me anything about myself. No. Most women in your circumstance, they would want to know things. Whether I drink, whether I have a temper, whether I am the kind of man who he started again, whether I would be safe to live near. My father told me who you were, he turned then. He said you were the kind of man who would ride 2 days through country, crawling with the men who had just shot you to get a stranger to a doctor, and then leave before the stranger could thank you. She held his gaze. He said the rest of it I could stand. Something happened in Holt Calloway's face that he did not intend to happen, and that he stopped before it became anything you could name. He looked away, picked up his cup, set it down again. Go up to the loft, he said. His voice was rougher than it had been. Sleep, she went. The ladder was solid. The loft had a low ceiling and a single window that faced east, and the blankets in the chest smelled of cedar and clean storage. She did not take off her boots. She lay down on top of the blankets, with her coat still on, and looked at the low cedar-planked ceiling and did not sleep for a long time. Below her she heard him moving, banking the fire properly. The soft sound of him laying out his own bedroll on the main floor. The particular silence of a man lying awake in the dark. She could tell from the quality of it. She had lived alone for 3 weeks since her father died, and she had learned things about silence in those 3 weeks. The way different kinds of silence feel in the boards of a building, and the silence below her was the silence of someone not sleeping, rather than the silence of someone asleep. She thought about the woman's hat on the shelf. She thought about the way his voice had gone rough when she said what her father had told her. She thought about Edmund Voss's face when he had stood on the porch of the house she had grown up in, polite, hat in hand, the expression of a man who had decided the outcome of the conversation before it began. She thought about the way he had looked at her, the way you look at livestock you are deciding whether to buy or to take. She thought, I did not walk 40 miles to be afraid tonight. She closed her eyes, and by sheer force of application she slept. In the room below her, Holt Calloway lay on his back on the plank floor with his blanket over him and his boots still on, and stared at the underside of the loft boards that held the floor of the space where Ruth Granger was sleeping, and thought about Dry Fork River. He had not let himself think about Dry Fork River in a long time. Not because he had forgotten it. You do not forget a thing like that. The mud going cold under you, the weight of the horse across your legs that you could not shift, the absolute arithmetic of your situation, which was that you were going to die in a particular spot in a particular way, and the only question remaining was the time frame. He had not thought about it, because thinking about it led to thinking about the man who had found him there, the rough hands hauling him up, the smell of trail dust and horse sweat, and the muttered string of quiet words he had later understood, with a man working through whether he could make the lift and deciding he could. 2 days across a saddle through country where the men who had put the bullet in him were still in the hills and still looking. He had come in and out of awareness like a lantern Someone was turning the wick on and off. At some point it had been cold. At some point it had been raining. At some point he had understood that the man carrying him was not stopping and was not going to stop and was not afraid. He had woken on a doctor's porch to early light and he was alone. He had sat up because sitting up seemed like the right direction to go. Eventually, if not immediately. His shirt was dark with old blood that had dried stiff. His side hurt in the specific way of a wound that has been field dressed by someone who knew what they were doing. The man was gone. He did not know who the man was. He had never learned. He had tried, later, when he was well enough to try, had asked the doctor who had treated him. But the doctor had only been given a name which was not a name so much as a direction, which was north and some miles. He had taken his hat off to the morning because there was no one to take it off for, and he had needed to do something with the feeling, and that was the only language for it he had at hand. He had not known anyone was watching. He lay on his floor and he thought about the girl asleep above him, who was not a girl but a woman who had walked 40 miles with a wound on her hand and said what she needed to say without asking for sympathy and eaten cold beans with a dignity that had somehow made the dignity more apparent rather than less. He thought about Sarah. He thought about Sarah the way he always thought about Sarah when he was awake in the dark and had nothing to occupy himself with, not her face, which had gone soft at the edges over 11 years, but the specific texture of her voice when she was concentrating on something. The way she said his name, like the second syllable, was a question. He thought about the November night 11 years ago when the doctor had come out to the waiting room and taken his hat off, and Holt had known, from the motion of that, before any words came. He thought about the weight of it, the absolute physical weight of grief, which no one tells you about, the way it presses down on your sternum, like something structural has given way. He had built this ranch with his hands in the years after, because his hands needed to be doing something that did not leave room for the other thing. He had built the fence past where practical stopped, because you could always run more fence. He had arranged his life with the specific intention that nothing in it would be the kind of thing that, if it were taken from him, would leave him in that waiting room again. It had worked, 11 years of it working. And then a woman had knocked on his door in the dying light of an August afternoon and said 2 words that he had kept behind glass for 9 years, the kind of glass you put around something you cannot afford to have disturbed, and the glass had cracked clean across before he had decided what to do about it. He was still awake when the gray came through the window. She came down the loft ladder in the dark before full light, already dressed, her coat buttoned and her hat pinned straight. Her boots were on. She had slept with her boots on. He understood that without needing to be told, a woman who has been running for 3 weeks sleeps with her boots on, because the decision to run or not to run should not require an additional step. He had the coffee on. The real fire now, not banked coals. He handed her a cup without ceremony, and she took it without ceremony, and they stood in the kitchen, in the half-dark, with the window going pale in the east and the stove putting heat into the room, and did not speak for a time that was long enough to be its own kind of communication. "You didn't sleep," she said at last. "No, did you think on it?" "I did nothing else." She waited. She had a quality of waiting that he had noticed the previous night, and noticed again. Now she did not fill silence the way most people filled silence, with the small sounds and adjustments of someone uncomfortable in it. She stood in it like it was a room she was used to. "I'll do it," he said. Something happened in her face. Something that was not quite what he expected, not relief exactly, or at least not only relief. There was something else in it. Something that was working to hold itself in check. "But you'll hear the terms," he said. "Same as I heard yours." He set his cup down on the table. "I was married before my wife died. I will not say more than that except to tell you it did not leave me in a condition where I intend to repeat the experience." He kept his voice level, and he kept his eyes on her, and he did not look away because he needed her to understand this part clearly. If you have any notion in your head that time and proximity might turn this into something else, put it down now. I am marrying you because there is a debt that is real and a man who is dangerous, and neither of those things is solved any other way. That is the beginning and the end of it. I understand. You will have your own room. This cabin is small, but I will build out. There will be a lock on the door and you will never need to wonder about it. I understand. You said you would earn your place. I will hold you to it because I do not take charity and I do not give it. You work equal to what you receive and you are a partner in this ranch, full and fair. And any man who speaks sideways about my wife answers to me. He let that sit for a moment. It is a cold offer. That is the entirety of what I have. Ruth Granger looked at him across the kitchen table, in the early morning light of the cabin he had built with his hands and arranged specifically to require no one else, and she looked at him the way she had looked at the fence line last night, coming down the switchback, reading it accurately. My father said you were warm underneath. He said the cold was weather, and under it you were warm. She set her cup beside his on the table, the two tin cups standing side by side. That's all right. I did not come here for warm. I came here for a wall, and a wall you can build from cold just as well as anything. She put her hand out. He took it. One shake. A contract between two people who had both decided to stop being surprised by what life required of them. There is a preacher in Harrow Creek, he said. 2 hours by horse. We go today. Sooner it is legal, the safer you are. All right. Do you have a dress that isn't? He gestured at the calico she was wearing, which had been blue once and was now the color of the road it had spent 2 days on. I have my mother's dress. I'll wear it. Then wear it. He reached for his hat off the peg by the door. The worn brown felt of it, shaped by years to the exact set of his head and Ruth. It was the first time he had used her name without the formality of the surname, and they both registered it not dramatically, but in the small intake that marked a shift in terms. When we ride into that town, you let me speak first. I know those people. Some of them are decent. Some of them would sell their own grandmother for the price of a beer, and you cannot always tell which is which from looking. He set the hat on his head. Voss has money and money has reach. We keep it simple. We are getting married. We do not say why and we do not say where you came from. I understand. Good. He opened the door on the morning, which was all copper and sage smell, and the sound of the horse in the east paddock moving along the rail. Then let's go get you your wall. Harrow Creek sat at the base of the eastern slope and had learned suspicion the way other towns learned a trade early, thoroughly, and with the full intention of passing it to the next generation. Holt had known the town for 11 years, and it had never once been glad to see him, and he had never once wanted it to be. He lived in a way that required very little from the town, and the town returned the favor. It was an arrangement he had found satisfactory. Today was not going to be a satisfactory day in Harrow Creek. He felt it before they reached the main street, felt it in the particular way the activity of the street redistributed itself when two riders came in from the North Road. The small recalibrations of people deciding how much attention to give a new thing without appearing to give it. He rode ahead, and Ruth rode behind him, on the gray mare he had saddled for her. Her mother's dress the color of faded cornflower under the dark wool of her coat, her hat pinned straight, her spine straight. Everything about her communicating a composure that he suspected was costing her more than it appeared to. Jack Doyle was outside the saloon. Jack Doyle was always outside the saloon at this hour, which was the one reliable fact about Harrow Creek. He had the lean, weathered look of a man whose primary occupation was watching other people's business, and whose secondary occupation was repeating it, and he stepped off the boardwalk into the street with the careful not blocking of a man who intends to be in your way, while maintaining that he is doing no such thing. Holt Calloway. The greeting had the cadence of a man who had been waiting for something interesting to happen and had found it. 11 years since I can recall you in town, and here you come with a lady nobody in this county has ever laid eyes on. Where'd you find her? Up that mountain of yours. Holt reined in. Because the man was close enough to the horse that riding on would have meant something that could not be walked back from, and Holt had learned a long time ago that the man who strikes first in a town like this has just written the story that everyone will tell about him, and the story becomes the thing rather than the truth of it. He dismounted. One smooth motion, unhurried. He walked to Doyle, and he stopped close enough that the easy quality of Doyle's expression became a more complicated thing. Quiet, low, the tone of a man who has made a decision and is informing the other party rather than negotiating. This woman is going to be my wife inside the hour. Every word you just said is a word you said to me. You can spend the rest of your life in this town as the man who insulted Holt Calloway's wife on her wedding day, or you can tip your hat and call it a good morning and we can all pretend this conversation did not occur. You've about 4 seconds to decide. The street had gone the particular quiet of a crowd holding its breath in unison. Doyle's jaw worked. His eyes went to the ring of watching faces and then back to Holt's face, and he was doing the calculation that a certain kind of small man always does in that moment, the arithmetic of public humiliation against the arithmetic of the alternative, and skin won the way it usually won. He raised his hand to his hat brim. "Morning, ma'am. Congratulations. Ruth from the Grey Mare, thank you." Clear, unruffled, the voice of a woman who accepted courtesy as her due and had no interest in the drama behind its delivery. Holt mounted back up and they rode the rest of the street in a silence that had changed quality entirely. "He will hate us for that," Ruth said quietly. "He hated us before. Now he will just be more polite about it." Holt reined up at the gate to the small house at the end of the street where Reverend Amos Pruitt had been marrying and burying Harrow Creek for 30 years. In a place like this, you cannot ask to be liked. You can only make yourself too much trouble to bother. Reverend Amos Pruitt was 70 years old and had stopped being surprised by human behavior somewhere in his 4th decade of officiating at the significant occasions of other people's lives. He opened the door, looked at Holt, looked at Ruth, looked at the two of them together in the way of a man reading a text he has read many variations of. He did not ask why. He asked only, were they of legal age? Both of them. And was there any lawful impediment on either side? Holt said no to the impediment. Ruth said no to the impediment. Pruitt got his Bible from the desk drawer. "I have married people for love," the old man said, finding his place in the book, and for land, and for reasons they took with them to their graves, without telling me a single word of it. "In 50 years I have learned exactly one thing about marriage." He looked up at Holt over the wire rims of his spectacles. "It does not matter in the slightest what brings two people to stand up here. It matters entirely what they do the morning after. Love that starts hot burns out. I have buried the marriages to prove it. But a marriage that begins as a promise kept." He paused, found something in Holt's face. That kind of fire catches slow. "I have buried fewer of those." He found his place again. "Take her hand, son. You cannot make a promise to a woman standing 3 feet from her." Holt hesitated, the hesitation of a man who has managed for 11 years not to have anyone's hand in his, who has arranged himself specifically around that absence. Then he reached back, and Ruth put her hand in his. Her fingers were cold, steady but cold, the steady of something that costs effort, rather than the steady of something that comes easy. His hand was steady because he had decided it would be. Pruitt read the words. The old words, the ones that had been said over every variation of human intention and arrangement and necessity for as long as people had found it useful to make promises to each other in front of witnesses. Holt said "I do" to the ceiling. He could not look at her while the words were being said. He was aware this was not ideal. He was aware of it the way you are aware of a thing you cannot immediately correct, with a flat acknowledgement that it is occurring and an intention to deal with it when the present crisis has resolved. He kept his eyes on the water stain on Pruitt's ceiling, and he said the words, and he meant them in the specific way he meant them, which was as a contract rather than a poem. Ruth said, "I do" to Reverend Pruitt directly, which was the honest version. Pruitt closed his book. "Morning after," he said, as though finishing a thought. "That is where it starts." They rode back up the mountain as husband and wife, and neither of them said anything about it for the first 40 minutes because there was nothing to say that would not sound either too large or too small for what had just occurred. It was Ruth who broke it, and she broke it the way she seemed to break most things, sideways, from an angle. "You said your vows to a water stain." Holt kept his eyes on the trail. "I was concentrating the entire ceremony. Every word. You were looking at that water stain like it owed you money. I was not looking at the stain specifically. You were looking at a point in space that happened to coincide exactly with a water stain, which is practically the same thing." A pause. "You have never in your life looked directly at a thing you were uncertain about, have you?" He rode on for a moment. "The morning I woke up on that doctor's porch," he said, and his voice had a quality she had not heard in it yet, something under the even surface of it. "When your father had already gone. I did not know what had happened to me or how I had gotten there. I sat up because that seemed like the correct direction." He paused. I don't remember taking my hat off, I truly don't. I don't remember thinking about it. I just did it. Ruth rode the gray mare beside him and did not speak. Your father watched me for 9 years on the basis of a moment I wasn't even fully conscious for, and then he sent you here. The trail narrowed around a bend of scrub pine, and he waited until it widened again. A man who would do that, who would spend 9 years watching a stranger, based on a moment the stranger does not remember. That is a man who looked very carefully at everything. He did, Ruth said. My whole life he looked carefully. I should not have mentioned your mother when we were talking. It was a small cruelty that was not necessary. She was quiet for a moment. Then you took it back before I had time to respond to it. That is not the same as not saying it. No, she agreed. But most men say the hard thing and leave it on the floor to go rotten. They don't take it back because taking it back costs something. She looked at the side of his face, which was the only view of it she had from this angle. You gave it back inside a minute. The high country opened up ahead of them, the ranch coming into view as they crested the last rise, the gray timber of the cabin, the solid lines of the fence, the dark horse in the east paddock moving along the rail. I have enough of those, Holt said, the small cruelties, the kind you had time to think about and did anyway. They come back to you at night when there is nothing to occupy the thinking. He clicked his tongue at the horse and picked up the pace, slightly, as the familiar ground opened beneath them. I don't intend to add to that inventory. Not with you. Ruth looked at the ranch spread below them in the afternoon light. My father was right about you, she said. Your father was right about a man who took his hat off one time when he didn't have to. He did not know the rest of it. He knew what mattered. Below in the paddock, the dark horse, the one nobody could get near, the one that moved with the specific agitation of a thing that had not been answered, lifted its head as they came down the approach and watched them come, and for once it did not press itself to the far corner of the fence. Ruth noticed. She noticed the way she seemed to notice most things, quietly and without announcing it. Tonight there would be the matter of supper, and after supper the matter of separate spaces in a small cabin, and the longer matter of two people learning to occupy the same walls without collision. There would be, at some point in the coming days, the matter of Edmund Voss, who already had a man asking questions somewhere south of where they now rode, whose patience for being told no was the particular thin patience of a man who had never built up tolerance for it. But that was the country ahead of them. This was the country now, the late sun on the high rock, the smell of pine and coming cold, the solid ground of the ranch that Holt Calloway had built to require nothing from anyone, and which was about to be asked to require a good deal more. Ruth Granger rode up to the gate of Stone Ridge Ranch for the first time as Ruth Calloway and did not say anything about that either, because some things you hold in your hands a moment before you know what they are. The dark horse watched her come. The first morning of the marriage was a Tuesday, and it looked like every other Tuesday Stone Ridge Ranch had seen in 11 years, which was to say it looked like a place that did not know anything had changed. The peaks caught the early light and held it the way they always held it, turning it from gray to copper to the particular gold that lasted about 40 minutes before the full sun came up and turned everything back to ordinary. The horse in the east paddock moved along the rail the same as always. The woodpile needed splitting the same as always. The hinge on the north window was still loose. Holt was up before the light made it through the east window. He had the fire going and the coffee on by the time the sky outside had committed to morning, and he was already dressed flannel work shirt, suspenders, worn denim trousers tucked into his boots when he heard movement in the loft above him. Not boots. Something quieter than boots. Then boots, the specific sound of someone putting them on while sitting on the edge of a cot rather than standing. He did not look at the loft ladder. He poured 2 cups of coffee and set one on the table and kept one in his hand and looked at the window because the window was a reasonable thing to look at. Ruth came down the ladder in the cornflower dress still, the coat over it. Hair pinned up in the practical way she wore it, no ornamentation, nothing that would get in her way. She crossed to the table, picked up the cup. Drank. You slept, he said. 4 hours. She looked at him over the rim. You didn't. I sleep when the work is done. The work of lying awake thinking is done. He did not answer that. She did not require an answer. She turned to look at the east window and the paddock beyond it, and the dark horse moving against the rail, and something in her expression shifted in the particular way of a person who has just noticed a problem they intend to solve. "That horse," she said. "Forget the horse. He hasn't eaten properly. You can tell from the way he carries his weight back he's anticipating discomfort when he moves forward. Something hurt him at the front and he hasn't stopped expecting it to hurt again." Holt looked at her. "I'm going out there," she said, and set her cup down. "Ruth." The word came out with more edge than he intended. She stopped with her hand on the door latch and looked back at him, patient in the way of someone who has heard a great number of no's in their life and has developed a method for evaluating which ones are final. "That animal is dangerous. He is not mean in the way that can be corrected. He has been mean since I bought him, and he has not improved. He has been afraid since you bought him," she said, not correcting him exactly, clarifying, the way you clarify a column of figures that adds up wrong. "Fear and mean look identical from outside the fence. The difference is entirely on the inside." She opened the door. "I'll be careful." He followed her to the porch because he was not going to stand inside the cabin while she walked into the east paddock alone, and he stood at the rail of the porch with his cup in his hand and watched her. She did not go to the gate immediately. She stood at the outside of the fence for a few minutes and watched the horse the way she had watched it through the kitchen window, studying the way it moved, the set of its ears, which direction it favored when it turned. The horse watched her back, dark eyes, suspicious, the whites showing at the edges in the way they showed when it was working through whether a thing was a threat. Then she climbed up onto the rail of the fence slowly, no sudden motion, and sat on the top bar and did nothing else. Just sat, watching the horse, not leaning toward it, not reaching out, not making any of the sounds people made at horses they were trying to gentle. She just occupied the same general geography as the animal, and let the animal decide what to do about it. The horse did not come near her, but it also stopped pressing itself to the far corner. Holt watched this for longer than he intended to watch it. He went back inside and he refilled his cup, and he came back out, and she was still sitting on the rail, and the horse was still 4 lengths away, and nothing had happened, and also something had happened, the kind of something that doesn't have an event attached to it, just a change in the quality of the air between two things. After 20 minutes the horse moved, not toward her, sideways along the fence, the way it moved when it was restless, but it moved to its left, not its right. And Ruth watched this, and then she climbed down from the rail on the left side of the gate, keeping herself in the animal's left side vision, and she walked back to the cabin without comment. "He's been hurt on his right," she said, coming in past him where he was still standing on the porch. "Someone came at him from that direction, and it was bad enough that he's been compensating for it since. He won't give anyone his right side because his right side is where the danger came from." She picked up her coffee cup. "You've been trying to work with him from his right every time, haven't you?" He had. He had not known he was doing it. In retrospect, it was obvious that he had been doing it. 8 months, he said. "You've been fighting with a horse that is asking a question and giving it a different answer every day." She drank. "My father used to say there is no such thing as a bad horse. There is only a horse that is asking something nobody has bothered to answer." That evening, standing at the fence in the failing light, Holt said the name quietly to the animal, the way you say a name to something that has never had one, not calling it over, just offering the name into the air between them, letting it be there. "Easy, Silas." The horse's ears moved, not dramatic, but forward toward the sound, which was the direction of attention rather than the direction of alarm. Inside the cabin, Ruth was at the table with the lamp lit and a spread of paper in front of her that had not been there that morning. Holt came in and saw the papers and recognized the haphazard collection of invoices and receipts and rough tallies that he kept in the tin box under the shelf. Everything he had used to approximate keeping track of the ranch's finances for 11 years, which was to say everything he had used to avoid thinking carefully about the ranch's finances for 11 years. She had not asked permission to take them out. She was working through them with the focused attention of someone who has found something that wants finding and is not going to stop until it is found. Her finger moved down a column of figures. She picked up the pencil, wrote something in the margin, moved to the next page. He sat down across the table from her and said nothing because she was clearly in the middle of something. and interrupting it seemed roughly equivalent to stepping on a man who was in the middle of a careful measurement. After another 40 minutes, she looked up. Her face had the flat quality of professional outrage, the expression of someone who has found a discrepancy that is not an error but a crime, and is taking a moment to be certain before she says so. "The man who sells you winter feed," she said. He waited. "He has been overcharging you. Not a little. Not the kind of thing that might be honest variation in pricing. He has been charging you nearly twice what the same feed runs at comparable suppliers. I have the figures from 3 operations I know of in this region, and none of them are paying what you are paying." She turned the paper so he could see the column she had marked. "I think he does it because you come to town once a year and you do not argue, and you do not check. You are easy money to him. You have been easy money to him for 11 years. Holt looked at the figures. He looked at them again, because looking at them once did not make them settle into sense. "That cannot be right." "It is right. I checked it 3 ways. She put the pencil down. "This is what I mean when I say anyone can add. I can find what numbers are trying not to say. And this set of numbers has been trying not to say this for a very long time." He looked at the number at the bottom of her column, the accumulated figure across 11 years. It was the kind of number that made a person want to put it down on the table and walk to the other side of the room before picking it back up. "Write the letters," he said. "Whatever suppliers you know. Write the letters and I will sign them." "I already started." She turned back to the papers, and the lamp put gold in the side of her face, and she was already working before she finished the sentence. "I will have them ready before the week is out." He sat at the table across from her in the lamplight and watched her work and understood something about himself that he had not known 11 years ago and had not had occasion to learn since. He had forgotten what it was to share a table with another person. Not the practical sharing of it, not the logistics, but the particular quality of an evening that has someone else's attention in it, someone else's small sounds of thought, someone else present on the other side of the light. He had forgotten that was a thing a person could have, or he had put it where he put the other things behind the glass, in the category of what was not for him anymore. He got up and banked the fire. He said good night. He went to the lean-to. He had begun building against the north wall of the cabin because he had meant what he said about separate rooms, and he was not a man who said a thing and then arranged circumstances so it didn't have to apply. The lean-to had a half-finished roof and a cot and a rolled blanket, and it was cold in the way of things that are not yet sealed against the mountain air. He lay on the cot and listened to the faint sound of movement inside the cabin, the scratch of pencil on paper, the soft shift of pages, and told himself the reason he could not sleep was the temperature. He almost convinced himself. The second week came in dry and bright, and Ruth worked the way she did, everything without announcement, without asking for assessment, with a completeness of attention that left no room for doing the thing partially. She was in the paddock with Silas every morning, before Holt had finished breakfast, working the long, slow process of introducing the horse to the idea that a person approaching from the left was not going to become a person approaching from the right. She did not use a lead rope on him for the first 4 days. She stood near him. She moved near him. She let him investigate the smell of her coat and the particular cut of her calico skirt against the fence rail, and she spoke to him in a low, continuous patter that was not commands and not coaxing but something closer to conversation, the ongoing account of what was happening as it happened, narrated back to the animal as a kind of contract. By the 5th day she had a halter on him. By the 8th day she was leading him around the paddock on a loose rope, with the ease of someone who has done this 1,000 times with 1,000 horses, and the ease was real, not performance. Holt watched this and did not say anything about it, because he had tried to say something about it on the 3rd day, and Ruth had listened to what he said, and then continued doing exactly what she had been doing, which was a form of answer that he found he could not argue with. He had owned that horse for 8 months, and had nothing to show for it but a fence in need of regular repair. Ruth had been on the ranch 11 days, and the horse was following her at a loose rope like they had been partners for years. He told himself this was useful. It was useful. It was an extremely useful development. On the morning of the 11th day, Holt rode down to Harrow Creek for salt and nails, and a few other things the ranch required. He went alone because he still did not like the idea of Ruth in that town with the specific quality of attention the town had given her on their wedding day. He rode with the kind of efficiency of purpose that marked all his trips to town: go in, get the goods, come back, interact with the minimum number of people required by the transaction. George Bates was behind the counter of the general store, and he had the look of a man carrying a thing that did not belong to him and was looking for the rightful owner. Holt. He kept his voice low, even though the store was empty at that hour. He looked at the door and then at the window and then at Holt. There was a man in here, 2 days back. Not from around here, you can tell. City cut to his vest, boots that haven't seen a working day, the kind of hands that do managing and not doing. He wiped down the counter with the cloth he always had, more out of habit than necessity. He asked, did I know a Holt Calloway? Asked, was it true you'd gotten married recent? Asked, did anybody know where the woman came from? Holt set down the list he had been consulting. What did you tell him? Nothing worth telling. Said, I sell goods and I mind my trade, and other men's business is other men's business. George Bates looked at him fully then. The first time in 11 years the man had looked at him with anything other than the pleasant vacancy of pure commerce. There was something in it now, the look of a man spending some of his own safety on a warning. But Holt, I was not the only person, he asked. This town has got mouths. Doyle would tell a rattlesnake his own mother's location for the price of a whiskey. Did this man say who sent him? He did not say. He did not need to, the way those things go. He rode out yesterday morning. South. Fast, not errand fast. News fast. The kind of fast that means whatever he found out is worth getting back to someone sooner rather than later. Holt paid for his goods and he left. He did not hurry through the main street. He did not hurry through the main street because hurrying would have given the watching windows something to look at, and he had spent 11 years managing what he gave the watching windows. But his hands had their own opinion, and the horse felt it, and the horse was moving at something between a walk and not a walk by the time the town fell behind them. Ruth was in the paddock with Silas when he came up the approach. She had the horse moving through a simple pattern at the end of a longer lead rope, a circle, then a stop, then a change of direction, the horse reading her body position and responding to it with an accuracy that had taken 8 months to fail to develop and 11 days to achieve. She looked up when Holt came through the gate and she read his and she dropped the rope into a trailing coil and came out of the paddock before he had dismounted. What happened? A man in town, 2 days ago, asking after us, asking where you came from. He tied off his horse and turned to face her. He rode south yesterday morning. Fast. Ruth was very still. South toward Voss Valley. That direction, yes. Then he has a name now. Whoever it was, he's riding back to Edmund Voss with Harrow Creek. Calloway married. She closed her eyes for 1 second. Just one, the exact duration of allowing herself to understand the thing fully before she had to deal with it. When she opened them, they were steady. How long before Voss knows? He may know already. Depends when the man rode out. Depends how fast the man wanted his pay. Holt looked at the sky, calculating. 40 miles down, 40 back if Voss comes himself. And a man like that will want to see the situation himself. Men who operate the way Voss operates, they need to see the thing with their own eyes before they decide what to do about it. So call it 3 days, maybe 4 days. She pressed the back of her hand briefly to her mouth, not distress, the gesture of someone doing rapid arithmetic with very little margin. And then what? He rides up here and what? He cannot take me. I am your lawful wife. The whole purpose of the marriage was to make that. She stopped because she had seen something in Holt's face. What? What is it? The law holds against a man who plays by the law, Holt said. A married woman cannot be collected on a dead man's debt. That part of the wall is solid and it will hold in any territorial court. He kept his eyes on her. But you told me yourself this stopped being about money the minute you told him no. A man who tips his hat while he tells you he owns your home and your future, both, that is a man who has built an entire life on the premise that the law is a fence, and fences only stop the man who agrees to stand behind them. Ruth looked at him for a long moment. You think he will come regardless? I think a man who owns half the badge wearing in 3 counties has spent a very long time learning that the law is exactly as solid as he needs it to be, and not 1 inch more solid than that. He picked up the salt from his saddlebag and carried it toward the cabin. So we stop pretending the marriage certificate is a wall. It is the start of a wall. We need more. The rest of that afternoon was different from the mornings that had preceded it. Not in what they did. Holt worked the fence line, and Ruth continued with Silas, and then moved to the books again as the light failed, but in what the work contained. Purpose had changed quality. Before, it was the ordinary purpose of a ranch operating, people doing what needed to be done. Now it was the purpose of two people who understood they were building something that was going to be tested. Over supper that evening, beans again, the staple of the ranch, Ruth had added something to them that improved them, but she did not mention it, and neither did he. She said, "Tell me what you know about Voss." Holt set his fork down. "I know what most people in this territory know, which is what he wants them to know. Largest spread in 3 counties. Bank holdings, relationships with the bench and the sheriff's office that are not friendships so much as arrangements." He thought about it. "I know he has been in that valley for 20 years, and that he arrived with less than what he has now, which is the part of the story he does not tell." "He arrived with nothing," Ruth said, "or nearly. My father told me." She looked at her plate. He had a brother, older. The two of them came out together with a small stake and started working. First year, a flood, in the spring, took everything livestock, crop, the entire season. The brother drowned trying to save the cattle. She turned her fork over in her hand. "My father said Voss stood on the bank and watched the water take everything, and he did not move. Not from fear. From something else. Something that was deciding." "What was it deciding?" "That he would never build a thing again," Ruth said. "Not with his hands. Because things you build with your hands can quit taken by weather and water and accident. But things you acquire with paper and law, he decided those were permanent. He decided the only permanent things were the things that existed in writing under his name, with the signatures of people who could not take them back." She set her fork down. "He has been acquiring ever since. With paper and law, exactly. And the people who work against him with their hands always lose, because hands cannot fight paper. So we fight him with paper," Holt said. "We fight him with the truth of his own paper," Ruth said. "There is a difference." The evening went quiet after that, but it was a productive quiet, the kind that has thinking in it. Ruth worked at the table, and Holt sat on the porch with the last of the light and thought about what she had said, and found it accurate and found it also insufficient, and tried to understand why it was insufficient, and arrived at: they needed to know which of Voss's papers were lies. And the only people who would know that were the people Voss had told the lies to. On the morning of the 14th day, 2 days after the news about Voss's man in Harrow Creek, 2 days closer to whatever was coming, Ruth was at the fence with Silas, before Holt had finished his second cup of coffee, and Holt came out to the porch and stood with the cup, and watched her do the thing she did with the animal, the steady, unhurried thing. And the horse was carrying himself differently from the way he had carried himself on the first day, head lower, ears relaxed, moving with something that was not quite ease yet, but was in the direction of ease, the direction of a creature that has been given a consistent answer to its question, and has started to believe the answer might hold. He had not realized until that morning that he had been watching her with the horse every day, not checking on her, not supervising, watching, in the specific way of someone who finds the thing they are watching worth the time it takes to watch it. He went back inside. That evening she asked him, "Why did you build this ranch so far from the town?" He considered the question from inside it, rather than around it. When Sarah died, he stopped. He did not often start sentences with those words, and when he did, they required more starting over. "When Sarah died, I did what most people do, which is that I stayed among people. Because people tell you to stay among people, and it seems like the right answer. For a while it seems like it. And then you realize that being among people who know what happened to you means being among people who know what happened to you, which is a different thing from comfort. People look at you in a particular way. They mean well, and they look at you, and you can see them thinking about it every time." He turned his cup in his hands. "I came up here because up here nobody was thinking about it. There was just the work and the altitude and no one's eyes." Ruth looked at the table. "I understand that," she said. "When your mother died, I was 11, so I did not have the option of removing myself anywhere. But I understand the principle of it." She straightened a piece of paper on the stack in front of her. "The way people look at you changes. Before it was a look that had nothing in it because you were just a person. After it is a look that has the knowledge of what you lost in it, which means every interaction contains the loss in addition to the interaction. It accumulates. You begin to feel you would rather deal with strangers who do not know the specifics. Yes, he said. That is exactly it. My father was the opposite. He stayed. He stayed in the same town and kept working with the same people, and he carried the weight of the knowing everywhere he went, and he never let it stop him from doing what needed to be done. She was quiet for a moment. I used to think that was stronger than what I would have done. Now I think it was just different. He needed the people. The knowing was the cost of having the people, and he decided it was worth the cost. And what do you need? She looked at him directly, a thing she did not do often without purpose. The direct meeting of eyes, that meant she was about to say something she had decided to say, rather than something that was occurring to her. I needed to stop waiting for someone who had power over my life to decide what happened next, she said. That is what I needed. I needed to be in a room where the decisions were being made, not a room where I was waiting to be informed of them. She looked back at the papers. Everything else I can manage. The fire settled in the stove. Outside, the wind had come up in the way it came up in the high country after dark, not a storm. Just the mountain reminding you it was there. Silas moved in the paddock, the soft percussion of his hooves in the dirt, and the sound was different from the restless circuit he used to pace. Slower, more deliberate. Holt said, "There are people in this territory who have dealt with Voss before, who lost something to him. The way he operates it is not a thing that happens once. A man does not build what he has built on a single transaction. There are others." Ruth looked up. "My father mentioned a family," she said slowly, the way of someone walking back into a memory they have not visited for a while. "In the valley, the Garretts. They ran cattle on a piece of ground along the river, good water, the kind Voss would want. My father said they lost everything to him 4 years ago. The son Tom, my father said he would not leave the county after. Said he stayed at the freight yard on the eastern edge, as far from Voss's land as a man could get, and still be close enough to look at what he had lost." Holt was quiet for a moment. A man who has already lost everything to Voss and stayed close enough to hate him properly every day. That is the kind of man Voss cannot threaten anymore. You cannot take from a man what is already gone. "That is the kind of man," Ruth said, "who might know where Voss keeps the things. Voss does not want found." They did not say anything else about it that night, but the shape of a direction had entered the room, and was occupying space in the thinking of both of them. And when Ruth finally closed the last of the ledger papers and set them in order on the shelf, she did not blow out the lamp immediately. She stood at the shelf for a moment, with her hand flat on the papers, and her eyes at the window, where the dark mountain held its own counsel. And she looked like a woman who has identified the next problem, and is in the first stage of solving it, which is the stage of making sure you have the right problem before you commit to the solution. On the 16th day, the letter arrived. It did not arrive as mail arrives in a proper town with proper service. A boy on a spent pony, a man of about 20, sunburned and nervous in the way of someone who has been told to hurry and has been hurrying and does not quite understand the full weight of what he is carrying, came up the approach in the early afternoon and stopped at the edge of the yard and would not come closer. Holt walked out to meet him. "Man in town paid me to bring this up." He held the letter out with the care of something he was not entirely comfortable holding. Said, "Give it to Calloway or the Calloway woman." Said, "Don't read it and don't stop for nothing." He swallowed. He said, "You would give me the second half of the payment. $2 to start, 2 on delivery." Holt took the letter and looked at the young man's face and saw the specific combination of eagerness for the money and genuine discomfort with the errand. "You did right," he said, and gave him the $2 and then 2 more besides it. "Now here is the important part. You ride home and you do not come back up this mountain. Not for any errand, not for any amount of money, not until I come down and tell you myself that it is all right. Do you hear me?" The young man looked at the $4 in his hand, and then at Holt's face, and whatever he saw in the face settled the question more thoroughly than the money. He nodded and rode. Ruth came out of the cabin and stood beside Holt in the yard. He had not called her. She had heard the hooves and come out, and she stood with her coat pulled tight against the afternoon wind and looked at the letter in his hand. "You know who it's from," she said. I know who it's from. Open it. He opened it. 1 page, heavy paper, the handwriting of a man who paid for good ink and good schooling, and used both to maximum effect. He read it to himself first. His face went to the particular arrangement it went to when he was processing information he did not like, and did not intend to show that he did not like. Then Ruth said, "Read it to me, all of it. Do not soften a single word," and he read it to her aloud, because he had made her a promise about the truth, and he was not in the habit of finding exceptions to his promises. Edmund Voss had written that he bore them no ill will. He had written that Ruth was her father's entire estate, and that the debt descended accordingly. He had written that in taking her as his wife, Holt had taken on her debts as his own. He had written that he was a great respecter of the law. He had written that he would call upon them within the week to discuss terms of settlement. He had written that he trusted they could conduct their business as gentlemen. Holt lowered the letter. Ruth's face had the quality of someone who has just watched a card game they suspected was crooked confirm itself as crooked. Not surprise. The specific sharp absence of surprise. "He is not coming for me anymore," she said. "The marriage protected me, so he is going around it. He is coming for the debt, and a debt he can collect in any court in the territory." She breathed in. "He is turning me into money. That is devil's clever. I am not a woman he cannot legally collect. I am a liability attached to a piece of property he can take through perfectly legitimate legal proceedings in front of any of the 3 judges he has arranged opinions with in advance." Holt folded the letter. He placed it inside his vest, flat against his chest. "He thinks we will fold," he said. "He thinks he will give us until the end of the week to sit up here on this mountain and get afraid, and by the time he rides up that approach, we will have talked ourselves into signing whatever he puts in front of us, because the alternative is losing everything in a legal process we cannot win." Ruth looked at him. "The week is not mercy," he said. "The week is a rope. He is giving us enough rope to hang ourselves with our own fear, so he does not have to spend the effort of doing it the other way." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Then we cannot wait for the week to end. If we sit here waiting for him, we have already lost, because either he takes the ranch in court or we crack from the waiting and give it to him ourselves." She looked at the folded letter shape under his vest. "You just said we need people who have already dealt with him. We have 3 days before whatever he is planning arrives at this gate." She pulled her coat tighter. "Tom Garrett is at the freight yard on the Eastern Road. We go tomorrow before he gets here. We go down his mountain before he finishes coming up ours." Holt looked at her in the late light of that afternoon, his wife of 16 days, who had walked 40 miles to his door, and in 16 days had gentled a horse no one else could touch and caught a thief he had been unknowingly feeding for a decade, and read the threat in a politely worded letter before the ink had cooled, and who was now proposing that instead of waiting to be outmaneuvered, they go and find the people who knew where the weaknesses were. He thought about what Reverend Pruitt had said about the morning after. This was not the morning after. This was the 16th morning after, and she was already doing exactly what Pruitt had meant. "We take the high trail," he said. "It adds 2 hours, but it does not cross any ground that Voss can call his. If he has men watching the main road, and he will have men watching the main road, the high trail keeps us from announcing ourselves before we are ready to be announced." "I know the high trail," Ruth said. "You walked me through it last week." He had. He had walked her through it in the context of teaching her the land, and she had memorized it the way she memorized everything completely, and, without apparent effort, the way a person memorizes things when they understand that the information is not academic. 6 in the morning, he said. "I'll have the horses saddled by 5:30. The dark came down over the mountain the way it can down in the high country, not gradually, but all at once, as though someone had made a decision. Holt stood on the porch for a moment before going in and looked at the lights in the valley below, the distant scatter of them, in the direction of Harrow Creek, and beyond that in the direction of Voss Valley. Though from this distance nothing was visible except the idea of it, the knowledge that down there in the lower country a man was writing letters with good ink and making arrangements with careful patience, and had decided that what he wanted and what he was going to have were one and the same. Inside, Ruth was at the table with the lamp lit, but she was not working on the ranch accounts. She was writing something else, a letter of her own, in a handwriting that was clear and quick in that was clear and quick and carried the signature of someone who had written a great deal in circumstances that required precision. He did not ask what it was. He banked the fire and said good night. She said he wrote that he would call within the week. He was being polite. I know. Men like that come early. They like to find you unprepared. I know, Holt said again. Which is why we leave before dawn. He went to the lean-to. The roof was almost finished. Now he had been working on it by lamplight in the evenings, sealing it against the coming cold, which was a thing he had begun doing without quite deciding to do it. The way a person makes preparations for a winter that is going to happen regardless of what they think about it. He lay on the cot and listened to the wind in the pines and thought about Tom Garrett, who had lost everything to Edmund Voss 4 years ago and had stayed at the border of the county and looked at what he had lost every single day. He thought, a man does not do that unless he is waiting for something, unless he has something left that Voss doesn't know about, unless he is keeping it for a moment that hasn't come yet. He thought about the letter folded against his chest, with its polite language and its precise legal framing and its quiet promise of annihilation. He thought about Ruth at the table, writing her counter-letter in the clear, precise hand of a woman who had decided she was going to be in the room where the decisions were made. He had told her this was a cold offer, a contract, not a poem. He had meant it, and he had believed it yet, and he still believed the meaning of it, which was that neither of them had arrived at this arrangement through the usual road. But a man who lies on a cot in a lean-to, he has been quietly finishing for 16 days, and tells himself it is only because the roof needs doing, is a man who is not being entirely straight with himself. He turned onto his side and looked at the wall. Tomorrow they would go down the mountain. They would find Tom Garrett at the freight yard, and they would learn what Tom Garrett knew, which Holt was increasingly certain was more than Voss wanted anyone to know. And then they would come back up, and they would be ready for whatever Edmund Voss brought up that road, ready in a way that was not just defensive, because a wall that only stands still and takes the blows comes down eventually. Holt had built enough walls to know that. The walls that held were the ones built on the right foundation, with the right material, placed where the pressure was actually coming from. And you could not find that out by sitting still and waiting for the pressure to arrive. They left Stone Ridge Ranch on the 17th morning of the marriage, before the sun had decided what kind of day it intended to be. The sky in the east was the color of old pewter, and the sage held the night cold in its branches, and the horses moved through it with the careful attention of animals that know the difference between a working ride and everything else. This was a working ride. They both knew it, and the horses knew it. Ruth had been awake since 4. Not from anxiety, from the specific discipline of a person who has identified the next problem and cannot afford to approach it unprepared. She had gone through what she knew about Tom Garrett 3 times in her head before she rose, organizing it the way she organized a column of figures before she committed anything to paper. What her father had told her, what she remembered from childhood, sitting on a corral fence while Silas Hollins worked a horse for the Garrett family's uncle. A boy older than her, watching from the other side of the fence, with the serious attention of someone learning something. The way his mother had moved through the yard, purposeful, recording everything, trusting nothing to memory alone. Holt had told her about the trail 2 days ago, when he walked her through the property's back terrain. Now she took the branch points without hesitation, and he rode beside her when the trail permitted it, and said nothing about the fact that she needed no guidance, because that was a thing he had learned about her. She did not require acknowledgement of competence. She required competence to be useful. The high trail added 2 hours, and the 2 hours were worth the addition. It brought them out onto the Eastern County Road from an angle that assumed nothing about where they had come from, which was the point. A man posting a watch on the roads out of Voss Valley would post it on the roads that made obvious sense. This road did not make obvious sense, which was why Holt had chosen it 11 years ago when he chose where to put the ranch, and why Ruth had memorized it the moment he showed it to her. The freight yard at the county line came into view around mid-morning. It was working at full capacity at that hour, wagons being loaded and unloaded, the shouts of teamsters carrying across the flat ground, the smell of pine resin and axle grease, and the particular dust that accumulated wherever heavy things were moved repeatedly over the same ground. Ruth looked at it from the tree line before they rode in. Not from caution exactly. From the habit of a person who reads a situation before entering it. We do not ask for him by name, Holt said, keeping his voice low. I know. A man asking for Tom Garrett by name at the first freight operation on Voss's border. That question is in Voss's ear by nightfall. I know, Holt. She looked at the yard. We will not need to ask. He looked at her. He will recognize me, she said. Or he will not, in which case we find another way. But if he is the man my father described, a man who stayed close enough to watch what he lost every single day, then he has made it his business to know every person connected to that valley, and my father was connected to that valley. They rode in from the east edge and tied the horses at the far hitching post, and walked into the yard the way people walk through a working space when they have business there and know where they are going, which was a manner that attracted no attention, because purposeful movement in a freight yard was the baseline and not the exception. Tom Garrett was directing a team of men at the loading dock when Ruth first saw him, lean, hard through the shoulders in the way of someone whose work did not stop, somewhere in his early 30s. His hands were the hands of a man who had spent years doing things that were not kind to hands. He was giving instructions with the efficiency of someone who had given these instructions many times and had refined them down to the essential words. Then he stopped. He had not looked in their direction. He had not heard anything over the yard noise that would have drawn his attention. But he stopped and turned and looked directly at Ruth with the expression of a man who has seen something arrive that he had not expected and had not prepared a response for. He took 2 steps toward them and stopped again. I know you. The words came out rough, stripped of the professional manner he had been using with his crew 30 seconds ago. You are Silas Hollins's girl. Ruth held herself still on the packed earth of the freight yard. Around them, the work continued its noise and motion, and nobody looked at them because nobody looked at 2 people having a conversation in a freight yard, unless the conversation became something other than a conversation. He trained horses for your uncle, she said. Years back, I used to sit on the fence. Tom Garrett's throat worked. Something moved through his face that arrived in Leia's recognition first, then the history behind the recognition. Then something that had been banked for 4 years and was suddenly getting air. He looked at Holt, back at Ruth. His eyes went briefly to the yard around them, to the loading dock, to the spaces between the sheds where sound traveled, and men moved with their ears open. There is a storage shed behind the axle yard, he said, low and fast. Nothing in it anyone needs. You come around the long side. 10 minutes. He was already turning back to his crew, already reassembling the manner he had set aside, already giving the next instruction before the sentence to them was finished. Ruth and Holt walked the long perimeter of the yard without speaking. The shed was where Tom had said a structure that had outlasted its original function and become the place where broken things waited to be decided about. The door hung from a worn hinge, and the inside held the smell of old iron and dry rot, and the particular quality of air in a space that had been empty long enough to forget it was once otherwise. Tom came in 4 minutes after them. He pulled the door to behind him and stood with his back to the wall and looked at them both, and his arms were crossed in the posture of a man who has been in this internal configuration for a very long time, braced against a weight that did not lift. Ruth told him what they had. She told him in order, without repetition. The note her father had signed for $400. The figure Voss had stated to Holt in their yard. The letter with Voss's name on it and its false claim. The request to see the original note and Voss's answer that it was in his office at his house. She told him about the threat Voss had wrapped in pleasantry at the end of the visit. The language about fire and isolation and accident. She did not repeat it more than once because she did not need to. Tom Garrett's face told her, before she finished describing it, that he already knew the shape of the thing she was describing. He said it to you that way, Tom said. Not asking, confirming. Word for word what he told us, Holt said. As though he had said it so many times the words had worn into a groove. Tom was quiet for a moment. His jaw worked. 2 weeks after we lost the land, he said. Our barn burned. The sheriff wrote it up as accident. Dry summer. A spark, no one at fault. He looked at the shed wall. The sheriff who had been on Voss's payroll since before my family filed their first deed. He stopped there. He did not say more about the fire, because he had said the essential thing, and anything further would have been for his own benefit, and not for the conversations. Ruth understood immediately why he had stopped. She filed the information in its correct place and moved to what mattered. "Your mother kept records," she said. Tom looked at her sharply. "My father told me," she said. "Not about Voss, about your family. He said your mother was the one who handled every transaction because your father couldn't write, that she kept a book." Tom uncrossed his arms. He looked at his hands. "Ward Garrett could not sign his name in English his entire life," he said. "Could not read a word of it. My mother Nora, she knew this, and she did not trust anyone else to remember it honestly. So she kept a ledger. 30 years of it. Every debt, every sale, every agreement my father ever made. His mark and her signature alongside it, with the date and the purpose. Because she said a woman who does not write things down is a woman who will eventually be told she misremembered." His voice had gone to a register below ordinary emotion, the register of something processed so many times it has worn its own channel. "Every man in that valley knew my father could not sign his name. It was not a secret. It was simply how things were. And the note Voss used," Ruth said, "had Ward Garrett's full name on it in script." Tom's voice was level in the specific way of something held level by a long-standing decision rather than by ease. "My father put his mark on things. He had a mark, 3 lines, always the same 3 lines. He never once wrote a name. Could not. The signature on that note was made by someone who knew the name and counted on no one looking closely enough to notice the difference." Ruth looked at Holt. Holt looked at the shed wall and was thinking. "You told the judge," Ruth said. "I stood in the courtroom and I said my father had never signed a document in his life, and could not have signed that note, and I said it in front of every person in that room." Something in Tom's voice changed quality, not louder, but denser, the way wood gets denser at the growth rings. "The judge told me to sit down or face contempt. The judge who had been dining at Voss's house since before I was born and who owed the expansion of his own property to a loan from Voss's bank that had never quite come due." "The ledger," Ruth said. "Nora's ledger. You kept it. 4 years. He looked at his hands again. The working raw surface of them, the evidence of 4 years of doing other men's freight at the border of the county he had lost. Every page, 30 years of her handwriting. Every time she signed for my father, the date and the reason, her name alongside his mark. Proof that the signature on that note was not his, and could not have been his. And I have had it the entire time, and there has not been one morning in 4 years that I have woken up knowing what to do with it," Ruth said. "Because every road into it leads to his courtroom, his sheriff, his judge, his bank that holds the paper on half the operations in this valley. I walk into any room within 50 miles with that ledger, and I do not walk back out the same way." He looked at her. "I have kept it like a man keeps a loaded gun with no target, waiting for something to aim at." Holt spoke then, measured and slow, the voice of a man testing ice before he steps onto it. "The note on your family's land is 4 years old. Cold evidence of a forged signature, but evidence that sits in a courtroom he controls." He paused. "The claim against Ruth's father is current. This year. Voss stated $1,100 to my face as a witnessed fact, when the original note says 400. That is a fresh lie told in front of a witness who can testify to it." Tom looked at him. "2 families," Ruth said. "The same mechanism. The same type of false instrument. Years apart but structurally identical." She let that sit for a moment. "A pattern is not the same as an incident. An incident a man can defend. A pattern describes a method, and a method that has been running for years across multiple families in multiple counties is not a matter for a territorial judge who has dinner arrangements with the defendant." Tom was very still. "Federal jurisdiction," he said. "Land fraud operating systematically across county lines," Ruth said. "With documentary evidence of the method from an earlier case, and a current documented false statement made in front of a witness. The letter Voss sent us his name on it, his claim that my father's land was collateral when it was never signed over. He wrote his lie down and signed it, because he has never once imagined that anyone standing close enough to hear him would be in a position to use it." Tom looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You need to get inside his house." "Yes." If what you are describing exists, if he keeps the real figures alongside the false ones, it will be there. I have thought about what must be in that house for 4 years. I have had no way in. He has guards. He does not let people through those walls who are not already his. There is one person, Ruth said. Both men looked at her. She took a moment. Not for effect, she was walking back into a memory she had not consulted in years, and she wanted to be accurate rather than convenient. Clara Birch, she said. She has kept house for Voss since I was a child. When my father did occasional work for the estate, she was always there. She gave me bread from the kitchen once. When I was waiting, I must have been 8 or 9. She said something to me I did not understand at the time. Ruth paused, retrieving it carefully. She said she stayed because she had to, not because she wanted to. She said it the way a person says something they have been holding for a long time and have finally said to someone who cannot do anything about it. Holt's voice was careful. A woman who has kept that house 11 years and said she stayed because she had to. That is not the same as a woman who will open a door for strangers in the middle of the night. No, Ruth agreed. It is not, but it is also not the same as a woman who would refuse to, given the right reason. She looked at the slant of light through the gap in the shed door. 11 years of keeping house for Edmund Voss. 11 years of knowing what she knows about how that house operates. A woman does not do that without arriving at a position on it. She paused. I think she has been waiting for what Tom has been waiting for. Not the courage she may have had the courage for years. The reason. Someone who could make the risk worth what it costs. Tom said, if Voss finds out she helped you. If we fail? Yes. Ruth met his eyes. Which is why we cannot fail. The matter-of-fact quality of this settled in the shed, and neither man challenged it, because it was not bravado. It was the statement of a woman who had spent 3 weeks making assessments of exactly this kind and had not yet been wrong about one. Holt said, even if Clara Birch opens a door, we do not know what we are looking for inside that house. We do not know where he keeps private records if he keeps them. He keeps them, Ruth said, and the certainty in it was not guesswork. A man who has been running an operation of this size for 20 years cannot hold the real figures in his head. He needs to know down to the dollar what he has taken versus what he has shown. Men who have lost everything once and rebuilt it through a method like this, they cannot stop counting. The counting is not operational. It is the proof to themselves that the loss has been more than replaced. She looked at Holt, and he told you himself where the proof lives. He said the note was in his office at his house, available for your inspection, and he said it without hesitation, because the inaccessibility of what is in that house is so complete in his mind that the location of it cannot be a threat. Holt was quiet for a moment. Then, he told the man he was trying to rob exactly where the evidence was kept, because he could not imagine who might be standing close enough to hear him say it. He could not imagine me in that barn counting his words, Ruth said. Holt looked at her. Something moved through his face that was not entirely about the plan. Tom Garrett put his hand out in the dim light of the shed, not for a handshake, for the older gesture, the one that means something more than an agreement. Holt put his hand on top of Tom's. Ruth put her hand on top of Holt's. 3 people in a broken shed at the county line, with 4 years of one family's loss and 3 weeks of another family's threat between them, and 1 ledger in a box somewhere, and 1 house they needed to get into, and a federal court in the territorial capital that had never once sat at Edmund Voss's dinner table. Tom said, there is a woman here who might carry a message to Clara Birch safely. May Cooper runs the cookhouse. She has known Clara 30 years. She would not carry a tale to that house for any inducement Voss could offer. She values her own judgment of herself too highly. They found May Cooper at the cookhouse behind the main building, rolling biscuit dough with the authority of someone who had been doing this particular task since before most of the men in the yard had been born. She looked at Ruth and Holt over the work surface with the assessing quality of a woman who has made reliable judgments about strangers from a cookhouse doorway for 40 years. Ruth told her what they needed. Not the full account, the essential shape of it. A message to Clara Birch that Silas Hollins's daughter needed to speak with her, that she remembered the bread, that there was a reason now, if Clara had been waiting for one. May Cooper did not stop working the dough while Ruth spoke. When Ruth finished, May Cooper looked at her for a moment, with an expression that contained no sentimentality and a great deal of intelligence. "Clara Birch has been in that house 11 years, she said. In 11 years not one person has asked her whether she wanted to be." She put the rolling pin down. "I will send word. Through proper channels, nothing that goes through any route he controls." She looked at Holt. "You will not come here again. If there is something to tell you, Tom Garrett will find the way to tell you." She looked back at Ruth. "And you plan this to succeed all the way, or you do not plan it. Clara Birch is not a woman you use and then leave where you found her." "I know," Ruth said. They rode back up the high trail in the afternoon. The light changed direction now, the peaks throwing their shadows down the slopes. They did not talk for the first hour. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the thinking that needed to happen between now and whatever came next required the quiet to do it in. When the trail widened and they could ride beside each other, Holt said, "When Voss comes to the ranch, and he is coming, within the week, probably sooner, I want you out of the main yard." Ruth looked at the trail ahead. "He has only seen you once," Holt said, "briefly on your father's porch, 3 weeks ago, in a situation where he was looking at you as a problem to manage rather than a face to memorize. He does not know what you look like with the precision of a man who has been studying you. So if I am not in front of him, he cannot confirm whether the woman his informant reported from Harrow Creek is the woman he came to collect." He paused. "Which buys us something. Not much, but something." "The horse," Ruth said. He looked at her. "Silas. He carries himself differently now than when Voss's man was in Harrow Creek asking questions about us. Anyone who knows horses would see the value in him immediately." She kept her eyes on the trail. "A man like Voss, when he rides into a yard, the first thing he does is assess what is in it. He sets the value of what he intends to take as low as possible before he makes his offer. It makes the theft easier to justify in the paperwork and easier to stomach in the telling." She looked at Holt. "Get Silas behind the barn before Voss is close enough to see him clearly. Let him think the ranch is worth less than the debt. Let him help himself do it." Holt was quiet for several seconds. Then he said, "With the particular careful quality of a man being accurate rather than generous, that is a better instinct than anything I had thought of." "I know," Ruth said, "not from vanity but from the same habit of accuracy. Voss came 2 days later, which was 1 day earlier than Holt had calculated, and exactly as early as the type of man he was would come. He arrived in the mid-morning with 2 men behind him, and Ruth was already in the barn with Silas before the sound of the hooves reached the yard from the lower trail. She had moved the horse, without fuss, talking to him in the low, continuous way she used when she needed him calm and purposeful rather than curious, and he had gone through the side door of the barn, with the cooperation of an animal that has learned the person asking has not yet asked for anything unreasonable. She found a gap in the barn wallboards that showed her the full width of the yard and the approach to the cabin. She stood there and she watched. Edmund Voss was older than she had remembered from the porch of her father's house, and softer in the face, and more dangerous for both of those qualities. He sat his horse with the ease of a man who had spent 20 years approaching things from a position of complete confidence in the outcome. He looked at the yard the way she had predicted the sweep of it, systematic, the cabin and the lean-to and the empty paddock and the wagon and the woodpile, each thing being assigned a value in the running calculation he kept. The empty paddock registered. She saw his eyes pause on it for a fraction longer than the other elements. He noted the absence of the horse he had perhaps expected to see, and then moved on, which meant he had filed the absence as information and set it aside, which was exactly what she had intended him to do. Holt stood in front of the cabin in his flannel work shirt and vest and trail-worn boots, thumbs hooked in his belt, the Winchester not visible but not far. He had arranged his face into the flat, unhurried nothing of a man who is neither afraid nor impressed, which was an expression Ruth had seen him use in town, and which was not a performance. It was simply what his face looked like when he had decided something in advance of the conversation. She listened. Voss did not dismount. He delivered the figure $1,100 with the smooth confidence of a man who has said a number so many times in this context that the number has ceased to feel like a lie and has become simply the number. She heard it and she felt it land in her chest with the specific weight of confirmation rather than shock. She had known he would say a false figure. Hearing the exact false figure he had chosen almost 3 times what her father had actually signed for, told her something precise about how he calculated his operations. He did not double. He nearly tripled, because the extra margin gave him room to negotiate down if pressed and still come away with more than the original debt. He had done this enough times to know exactly how much room he needed. She kept her breathing even. Holt asked to see the original note. He said it plainly, and without accusation, just a reasonable request from a man who was being asked to sign over his entire property on the basis of a number he had only heard stated aloud. Voss said the documents were secured at his office at home and that Holt was welcome to view them there at any time. In the barn, Ruth closed her eyes for one breath. He cannot show it. The note exists and it says $400, and he cannot hand it to Holt without handing Holt the proof that the number he just stated is a lie. The note is in that house, in that office, and it says 400, and that is why the office at the house is where Holt is welcome to go, and not anywhere else. She opened her eyes and watched Holt tell Voss he needed a week to think. She watched Voss accept this with the particular patience of a man who knows what the week is actually for. Then she watched Voss pause before he turned his horse. The pause was not accidental. Nothing Edmund Voss did was accidental. He had been doing this long enough that every element of his manner was deliberate, including the pauses. He spoke about the ranch's isolation, the altitude, the distance from neighbors. He spoke about what could happen to a property in a dry summer fire moving through feed grass, water sources going bad, stock wandering. He spoke about it in the voice of a man sharing observations about the natural risks of frontier life with a neighbor he genuinely liked. Ruth stood in the barn and listened to this and did not move and did not make a sound and committed every word of it to memory, not because she needed to, but because she wanted the exact language, not the shape of the threat, the exact words, because exact words in a man's own mouth, recalled by a witness, were a different order of evidence than a paraphrase. She had what she needed. Voss left. The 3 horses went down the trail at the same unhurried pace they had arrived, which was the pace of men who did not expect the thing they were leaving, to do anything unexpected before they came back for it. Ruth came out of the barn when the sound of hooves had faded fully from the approach. She crossed the yard and came to stand beside Holt, and they both looked at the empty trail for a moment. $400, she said. Her voice was even. I held that note. I read the figure in my father's handwriting, and I watched him sign it with a hand that was already shaking from the fever. $400. She looked at the trail where Voss had gone. He said 1100 to your face, because he has said a number like that to enough men in enough yards that it no longer feels like a statement that can be checked. It feels like a fact. He cannot show us the note, Holt said. He cannot show us the note. He told you it was in his house, and he meant it as reassurance, and it was a confession. She turned to look at him. He walked into our yard and confessed the location of the evidence that convicts him, because it never once occurred to him that I was standing in that barn counting his words. Holt looked at her. He threatened us at the end, she said. The fire, the water, the isolation. He said it pleasantly, and he smiled while he said it. I heard him. I need you to hear something else. She held his gaze steadily. The week he gave us is not consideration. It is what he does instead of spending the money and the risk of doing it the direct way. He expects us to imagine for 7 nights what he described and to come apart from the imagining and signs whatever he brings up that trail at the end of the week. She paused. We do not spend the week imagining it. We spend it doing what we went to the freight yard to start. Holt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Clara Birch. If May Cooper's message reaches her, and she agrees to meet, we will know within 2 days. Ruth looked at the cabin, at the lean-to addition with its new roof, at the paddock where Silas was waiting to be let back in. And if she agrees to more than meet, what happened next was the hard conversation, and Holt started it that evening. And he started it the way he started things. He was not entirely prepared to start directly, without the preamble that would have made it easier, because he was not a man who found preamble honest. They were at the table after supper, and the lamp was lit, and Ruth had the paper in front of her that she had been working through since the afternoon, her reconstruction of everything she knew about the inside of Voss's house, from childhood memory and from what Clara Birch had said in the message. May Cooper had relayed a first message, cautious, but enough to confirm that Clara was still in that house, and that the door May Cooper had knocked on was not locked. Holt said, "I am going to say no." Ruth looked up from the paper. "Whatever the next step is, that requires you to go into that house," he said, "I am going to say no, and I need you to understand that I am not saying it because I think you cannot do it. I am saying it because the thought of you in there and me outside it is the kind of thing I have been successfully not feeling for 11 years and have apparently failed to keep not feeling." The lamp made its small sound. Outside, Silas moved in the paddock. Ruth looked at Holt across the table, with the direct quality she used for important things, and she let what he had just said exist in the room without filling the space around it. Then she said, "You told me I was a partner in this ranch, equally and fully. You said it in the terms and you meant it. I meant it. A partner does not wait in the cabin when the partner they are equal to is out on a field they cannot see." She kept her voice even. "And there is something else. If what is in that house requires someone who can read a set of books accurately enough to explain them to a federal officer, then I am not only the person most able to go in, I am the only person for whom going in makes the whole plan work." She looked at him. "You need me in there. Not because I am brave, because I am the right instrument for the specific task." Holt looked at the table. "Then I am 40 feet from whatever door you go through," he said. "Every minute you are inside. That is not a negotiation, and it is not a condition I will adjust." He looked up. "And you come out the moment anything changes. Not when you have finished. The moment anything changes, you leave whatever you have found and you run." Ruth looked at him, and she heard what was underneath the logistical language. The thing he had said at the beginning of the conversation that he had not repeated, but that was still in the room. The specific admission of a man who had spent 11 years successfully not feeling something and had found his way to the other side of that without quite deciding to. She did not point to it. She did not ask him to say it again or say it differently. She received it the way she received most things he gave her, quietly, completely, without requiring it to be anything other than what it was. "Together," she said. "Together," Tom Garrett said from the memory of the shed, and she heard his voice in it, even though he was not there. Because that was how it felt, the three of them. The weight of 4 years and 3 weeks and 30 years, of a woman's handwriting, all of it pointed at the same door. The message from May Cooper came the next morning through Tom, who rode up the ranch road at first light and handed it to Holt at the gate, without stopping long enough for the horses to get comfortable. Ruth read it at the table with the lamp still burning from the night. Clara Birch would meet her. One condition. The meeting place was May Cooper's kitchen at the freight yard, on Clara's Thursday afternoon out, which was the only half day in the week she was permitted. Ruth read the message twice. Then she looked at Holt. "Thursday," she said. 3 days. 3 days to prepare, and then we know whether she will open the door." She folded the message into her coat, and Holt she stopped. He waited. Whatever Clara Birch decides on Thursday, she is making that decision with full knowledge of what it costs her. We do not minimize what we are asking. We do not make it sound smaller than it is to make it easier for her to say yes. She held his eyes. She has to say yes knowing the whole size of it. Otherwise we are doing to her what Voss has done to everyone else, which is arranging the terms of a transaction, so the other person cannot see the full price until it is too late to decline. Holt looked at her for a moment. "Your father," he said, "raised someone who knows the difference between persuasion and manipulation. He raised someone who kept his books," Ruth said. "And books do not lie. They only fail to volunteer. You have to know what to look for." She went to saddle the gray mare for the ride they both knew was coming, and behind her Holt sat at the table for a moment longer than necessary, looking at the lamp and not at anything else, doing the thing he did when he was processing something he had not expected to be true and was in the early stages of deciding how to live with the fact that it was. Wednesday passed the way days pass, when the thing coming on Thursday is the only real thing and everything else is the hours between now and then. Holt split wood that did not need splitting yet, and checked fence line that he had checked 4 days ago, and found himself standing at the paddock rail twice without having decided to walk there. Ruth spent the morning at the table with 2 pieces of paper side by side, one blank, one containing the letter from May Cooper, and wrote and crossed out and rewrote until she had what she wanted. which was a map of everything they knew about the inside of Voss's house, distilled from every word Clara Birch had put into May Cooper's hands. The study, the left side of the fireplace, the walnut paneling that ran floor to ceiling and had one section that was not paneling at all. 2 books behind it, the black one and the green one. She folded her notes and put them in her coat pocket, and went out to the paddock and stood with Silas for 40 minutes, and did not think about Thursday at all, which was the only way she had found to keep herself functional in the days since a plan had moved from concept to scheduled event. Holt came and stood at the rail beside her, not saying anything, just standing in the way he had been learning to stand near her, not filling the space between them with management or instruction, just occupying the same geography and letting what was in it be in it. She said, "My father was not afraid of dying. He told me so. He said he had done what he came to do, and he was not afraid of the finishing of it." She kept her eyes on Silas, who was working through a slow circuit of the paddock, with his head at a comfortable height, an animal no longer perpetually braced for the blow from the blind side. He said the only thing he was afraid of was what came after. For me, he said he had watched his whole life what happened to women alone, and he could not bear to go without doing something about it. Holt was quiet. "I spent 3 weeks after he died being angry at him for that," she said, "for sending me to a stranger, for using his last weeks to arrange a transaction involving my future without asking me what I thought of the arrangement. You were not angry when you came up the trail." "No. By the time I came up the trail I had finished being angry, because I had run out of alternatives, and anger that has no alternatives has to become something else or it becomes nothing." She looked at the mountains, the way the late afternoon lit the rock faces in amber and shadow. "It became this. Whatever this is." Holt looked at the mountains too for a moment. Then he said, "Your father told you that you could trust the rest of it. After the horse story. After Dry Fork River." He paused. He was right that I would try to find a way out of it. He was right that I would not be able to. He was usually right about people. It was his one consistent vanity. The corner of Holt's mouth moved in the way it sometimes moved now, not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. The place where a smile would be if it decided to arrive. "I need to say something," he said, "before tomorrow." She waited. "When I made the terms of this arrangement clear, when I told you it was a contract and not a poem, and that I was not a man who had anything else to offer, I meant it as a protection. Not for me. For you." He looked at the paddock and nodded at her. "A man who tells a woman clearly what he is and is not capable of, is a man who is not letting her build on ground that will not hold." I understood that. "I need you to know that the ground has shifted," he said. "Not what I told you that was true when I said it, but 11 years of making myself into something that cannot lose anything, because it does not have anything turned out to have a time limit I was not aware of." He paused with the precision of a man measuring what he is about to say against whether he can say it accurately. "You walking into that house tomorrow night, I need you to understand that when I say I will be 40 feet from that door, I am not saying it because it is what a husband is supposed to say. I am saying it because the thought of you in there and me not close enough to be of use is the specific kind of intolerable that I had successfully eliminated from my life for 11 years and have apparently failed to keep eliminated." Ruth looked at him. The late light caught the side of his face, and she could see the thing in it, that she could see the thing it, and that she had been watching develop for 3 weeks, the way you watch a thing you were not supposed to be watching, because it was not part of the arrangement. "You named the horse Silas," she said. "Yes. On the 3rd day. You thought I was inside. You were at the window. I was at the window." She let that sit. "I did not say anything about it, because some things a person does when they think they are alone should not be required to become something they said out loud and have to stand behind in daylight." He turned then and looked at her directly. "I am not afraid of standing behind it," he said. "I am afraid of you going into that house tomorrow and not coming out." Ruth looked back at him for a long moment, the kind of moment that does not need what comes after it to be immediate. Then she kissed him, not tentatively, not as question, as the statement that it was the statement of a woman who has been watching a door for 3 weeks and has decided to be the one who opens it. His hand came up and held the side of her face, the working raw warmth of it against her jaw, and neither of them said anything else, because there was nothing that needed to be said after that, which words would have improved on. When she stepped back, his eyes were still on her face, with the look of a man who has just discovered that the thing he spent 11 years fortifying against was already inside the walls and had been for some time, and he had not noticed because it had not announced itself the way he expected. "Don't be afraid of it," she said quietly. "I came back from 40 miles. I will come back from one house." He did not say he was not afraid. That would have been a lesser kind of honesty than the one they had been building between them. Thursday morning they went through every step 3 times. Not because either of them needed to hear it 3 times, but because each pass throughout the plan revealed a different thing to check, and none of the 3 passes revealed anything they had not already prepared for, which was the closest thing to confidence you could get with a plan of this nature. Tom Garrett would have the wagon at the county road, 300 yards north of Voss's property line by 8 in the evening. The wagon carried a legitimate load of broken axle hardware, which was Tom's business and which gave him reason to be on that road at any hour without explanation. The false bottom had been built that morning with boards Tom had sourced from the freight yard's own discard pile, thin enough to make the cavity but thick enough to hold the weight of whatever needed to go into it. Clara Birch had confirmed through May Cooper that the study door faced the interior hall and not the exterior garden, which meant the window that faced the garden would be dark, regardless of whether someone was in the room, which meant Holt could position himself at the garden wall without the window giving him away, and the kitchen door off the latch from 6 in the evening. Clara's word, through 2 relays, and Ruth had made her assessment of Clara Birch through the lens of memory and of the letter May Cooper had carried, and had decided this woman's word was solid. Not because she had nothing to lose, she had everything to lose, but because she had said she would, and she was the kind of person for whom that sentence meant something that could not be walked back from. They rode down the high trail in the late afternoon, all 3 of them, Ruth and Holt and Tom, who had come up the ranch road at 4 to ride with them as far as the county line. The trail held the last warmth of the October sun, and the sage was dry and silver, and the horses picked their way through the switchbacks with the careful attention of animals that knew the difference between going to work and going to rest. Nobody said much. The time for saying things had been the morning. This was the time for doing them. At the county road, Tom peeled off to position the wagon. Holt and Ruth continued south on foot, from the place where they left the horses in a stand of cottonwood 200 yards from the property line. The light was going. The sky in the west had the colors of something burning far away, orange and deep red above the mountains, the kind of sunset that would have been beautiful if either of them had been in a position to look at it for its own sake. Voss House sat back from the road behind a stone wall and a row of mature pine that had been planted when the house was built, and had grown to enclose the property in a way that said permanence, and also said it was nobody's business what happened inside them. The windows facing the road were dark. A single lamp burned in the kitchen wing, low and yellow, the specific lamp quality of a light that has been left burning deliberately and not for illumination but for signal. Clara Birch was in there. The door was off the latch. Holt stopped at the shadow of the garden wall and put his back to the stone and looked at Ruth. She was wearing the dark calico, the one that had been blue once and was now the color of the road, and which she had specifically selected because the road color was nearly invisible against a stone wall after dark. Her hair was pinned up tight with no loose to catch on anything. Her coat was dark wool. She looked like someone who had thought carefully about not being seen, and had then made a series of practical decisions about how not to be seen. "Green book," he said, "not the black one. Green book. You are in and out. If you hear anything that should not be there, if anything changes, you come out the kitchen door immediately. You do not wait to see what it is. I know. If I whistle one long note, you drop everything and you run. You run to the north and you do not stop running until you reach the cottonwoods. I know, Holt, and you come back to me." He said it without looking at the wall or the house or anything except her. Whatever is in there, it is not worth the alternative. Ruth looked at him for 1 second with everything she had been keeping behind the practical and efficient surface of her face for 3 weeks, and then she said, "I walked 40 miles to find you. I am not going to lose you over one house." And the distinction of that, the way she had shifted the sentence from herself to him, from her safety to his, The implication of what the alternative would cost her landed in his chest with a weight that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with what 3 weeks of walls coming down piece by piece had left in their place. She kissed him quickly, the way you do a thing when the time for the longer version has not arrived yet, but you need something to mark the moment. And then she turned and went across the dark yard toward the kitchen door. He watched her reach it, watched the door open, the thin line of lamplight, the shape of Clara Birch in the opening brief, and then Ruth was inside, and the door was closed, and the yard was dark again, and the line of lamplight was gone. Holt put his back to the garden wall, settled the rifle across his knees, and waited. The waiting was its own particular discipline. He had done this kind of waiting before, in different circumstances, and the skill of it was the same. You did not fill the time with imagination, because imagination in a dark yard outside, a house where someone you could not afford to lose had just gone, was a catastrophic investment. You filled it with what was immediately available: the texture of the stone at his back, the temperature of the air, the sounds that were the house's ordinary sounds, and the sounds that would not be ordinary. The house breathed the way old houses breathe. Structural sounds, the tick of cooling wood, a window somewhere on the upper story that had a loose pane and spoke in the wind. Nothing that was not the house being itself. Inside, Ruth followed Clara Birch through a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs, and the specific domestic order of a space maintained by a woman who had made cleanliness the one domain in which she had complete authority. Clara moved without a lamp. She did not need one. 15 years of moving through this house in the dark had given her the building by feel and memory. She led Ruth by the wrist through the kitchen and into the corridor, and down the corridor to the closed door of the study. The door opened without noise. Clara had oiled the hinge that afternoon. The study was dark except for what came through the window from the distant moon. Enough light to see shapes and not colors. A large desk, an unlit fireplace, bookshelves floor to ceiling on 3 walls. And the 4th wall, the one with the walnut paneling that Clara moved toward without hesitation. The one she had dusted 1,000 times with the flat specific knowledge of what was behind it. Clara stopped at the section left of the fireplace. She placed her hands on the paneling at a height that was not instinct but memory. The exact height of something you have looked at for so long you know its dimensions the way you know the dimensions of your own face. She pressed at the right edge of the 3rd panel. A click. Almost no sound. The panel swung inward on a mechanism that had been built by someone who was very good at the work and had then apparently had bad luck on the road home. 2 books, both bound in leather, one black, one green. Ruth took the green one. She opened it at random in the dark and held it at the angle where the window light fell on the page and read what was there in the careful script of a man who could not stop himself from keeping accurate count of what he had accumulated. The page she had opened to was dated 3 years ago. 4 names, $4 amounts in one column, 4 different larger dollar amounts in the next column. The difference between the 2 columns annotated with a single word in the margin. She read the word and closed the book. The word was collected. She put the green book inside her coat, flat against her ribs, and buttoned the coat over it. Clara replaced the panel. The click of it seating back into place was the quietest sound in the room. Ruth looked at the study around her, the desk and the shelves and the fireplace with its cold ash, and understood that she was looking at the room where Edmund Voss sat, and counted what he had taken and felt satisfied, and the understanding was not abstract anymore. It was the page she had just read. It was 4 names, and the difference between what those 4 people had actually owed and what he had collected, annotated with a word. They went back through the corridor, back through the kitchen. Clara put her hand on the kitchen door latch and stopped. Horses. Not one. Not the ordinary approach of a single rider returning to the property. Multiple. From the South Road, which was the road from the county seat, which was the road that should not have had those hoofbeats on it for another 4 hours. Clara and Ruth stood in the dark kitchen and looked at each other, and the specific calculus of the moment was this. The kitchen door opened onto the east yard. The route to the garden wall and to Holt was across that yard, and the horses were on the South Road, which meant they would be coming up the main drive, which was the west approach, which meant there was a window of time between when the horses reached the gate and when the riders would have eyes on the east yard. A window. Not a large one. Ruth put her hand over Clara's on the door latch. Clara stepped back. Ruth opened the kitchen door herself, slowly, an inch, 2 inches, enough to see the east yard. Dark, empty. The garden wall at the far edge. She could hear the horses clearly now. They had come through the main gate. She could hear the change in hoofbeats when they hit the gravel of the main drive. Coming fast. Not the returning from dinner pace of a man who had spent the evening in comfortable company. This was a different pace. This was the pace of a man who had found out something on the road that had changed the pace. She was out the kitchen door before she made the decision to go. Her boots on the packed earth of the east yard. No sound. The dark calico invisible against the wall of the kitchen wing. She went along the wall to the corner where the kitchen wing met the garden wall. From here she could see the length of the east yard and the opening in the garden wall, and beyond it the dark field that ran north to the county road. She could also hear Voss's voice, carrying from the main drive around the front of the house, rapid, tight, giving orders in the clipped tone of a man recalibrating a plan at speed. And then from the direction of the garden wall, the sound she had been waiting for. One long whistle, low, carrying no further than it needed to. She ran. Not panicked ran. Purposeful ran, the kind of running that knows where it is going, and commits to getting there without waste. Across the east yard, through the gap in the garden wall, and into the field beyond it, and the field was rough and dark, and she did not slow down for either of those qualities. A shape came out of the shadow of the garden wall's exterior. Holt. He had heard the horses, and he had moved to intercept her line of exit, and he had timed it so that he was at the gap when she came through it, and they did not stop. They kept moving. Both of them. North across the field in the direction of the county road. Behind them. From the front of Voss house. The sound of lamps being lit, the yellow glow of it visible even from the field. The windows of the study blooming first. She ran with the book against her ribs, and it was solid. Present. Real. She could hear Holt beside her, his breathing even the way it was. Even when he was doing something difficult, the specific breathing of a man who has decided that the difficult thing is not going to be permitted to show in his breath. They reached the hedgerow at the field's north edge and pushed through it, and the county road was there, and the wagon was there. Tom Garrett on the seat with the reins in his hands, and the horses already pointed north. Tom had the false bottom open before they reached the wagon. The green book went in, flat, invisible under the board. The board went back. The load of broken axle hardware settled over it. Clara came out of the darkness of the hedgerow 30 seconds behind them. She had come through the kitchen and out the back gate of the garden, and across the east field by memory, and she was breathing hard, and she was carrying nothing from that house except herself and 15 years of knowledge about what was in it and what it meant. She looked at Ruth. Ruth looked back at her. "Get in," Tom said. And Clara got in the wagon, and Ruth and Holt took to their horses from the cottonwood stand, and the four of them moved north on the county road in the dark, away from the light that was multiplying in the windows of Voss house behind them. At the house, Voss stood in his study and looked at the panel that Clara had reseated with the precision of 15 years of knowing exactly how it sat. He pressed it. The click. The panel swung. He looked at what was there. The black book. He looked at the space beside it where the green book lived, where it had lived for 7 years. The exact dimensions of the absence. The sound that came from Edmund Voss in that moment was not dramatic. It was quiet, the specific quiet of a man whose architecture has just failed at the load-bearing point. He had built his entire operation on the premise that what was written down in that book was inaccessible, that the book's existence was proof of his own intelligence, the proof that he was smarter than the operation required him to be, that he could have run it without keeping accurate records, and he had kept them anyway because he needed to know. Needed to know down to the dollar. Needed to see the accumulated figure in his own handwriting, because the accumulated figure was the evidence of having rebuilt what had been taken from him, the proof that what the water had washed away had been more than replaced. He had kept it for himself. He had never imagined anyone else would ever see it. On the county road heading north, Ruth rode with one hand inside her coat over the place where the book had been. The way you keep your hand over a wound, you know, has stopped bleeding, but cannot quite convince yourself to stop checking. Holt rode beside her. Not ahead, not behind. Beside. He will know by morning, Holt said. Yes. He will know we have it. He may not know we have it specifically, not immediately, but he will know the book is gone, and he will know that means someone was in that house tonight with the knowledge of where it was. Clara is the only person with that knowledge. He will know that too. Ruth looked at the dark road ahead. Clara is not going back. No. She knew that when she opened the door for me. Yes. The four of them rode north. The wagon and the two riders, and the mountain that held Stone Ridge Ranch rose ahead of them in the dark, and the stars came out in the way. They came out in the high country, not gradually but all at once, as though they had been there all along, and the dark had just finally gotten deep enough to show them. They stopped at Tom Garrett's boarding situation on the east edge of the county at midnight. Not because they were safe, they would not be safe until the book was somewhere. Voss could not reach it, but because the horses needed water and the people needed to assess. Tom got the wagon under cover in the shed behind the building. The false bottom stayed closed. The book stayed where it was. They sat at a table in the back of a dark building, and Ruth opened her coat, and Tom lit one small lamp, and they looked at each other. He will send men to find Clara, Holt said. Tom said, she has nowhere to go. She has here, Holt said, tonight. And then we move. Clara was sitting at the end of the table, with her hands folded on the surface in the posture of a woman who has made the largest decision of the last 15 years and is in the process of discovering what it feels like to be on the other side of it. She looked steady. Not calm exactly. Steadiness is different from calm. It is the thing that remains after calm has processed the situation and decided this is what is left to stand on. He will say I stole it, she said. He will say whatever serves him, Ruth said. But a man who claims a book was stolen from a secret compartment in a room in his private house, a compartment that did not officially exist, has to explain the book in order to claim it was stolen. And explaining the book means explaining what is in it. Clara looked at Ruth. What is in it? Ruth told her. Not all of it. She had only seen 2 pages in the dark, and the full accounting was still sealed under axle hardware in a wagon in the shed. But she told her the structure of it, the true figures beside the false ones, the annotation in the margin. Clara listened with the expression of a woman hearing a thing confirmed that she had known without documentation for a very long time. There are more than our family in that book, Tom said. It was not a question. There will be, Ruth said. A ledger like that, kept over years, it will contain every transaction he ran this way. Every family, every dollar. She looked at the tabletop. Which means when this goes to the right court, it is not one family's claim, and it is not 2. It is the record in his own hand of a systematic operation spanning years and counties. What is the right court? Tom said. Federal jurisdiction, Holt said. Land fraud, forged instruments, systematic deception across county lines. That is not a matter for a territorial judge who has dinner arrangements with the defendant. The circuit court at the territorial capital. A federal presence that is not inside the radius of what Voss owns. How far? Clara said. Day and a half at a hard ride, Holt said. Less if we push. They all sat with this for a moment. Then Tom said, he will have men on every road out of this county by morning. Every road he knows to watch, Holt said. The high trail added 2 hours to our ride this morning and kept us off 3 roads he would have had covered. The territory is larger than his attention. Ruth was looking at the table, thinking through something. They could see the calculation moving across her face, the way you watch weather approach from a distance, the shape of it changing as it comes closer. We do not take the book to the territorial capital as it is, she said. We take it as evidence in a formal complaint, which means before we ride, I need to be able to explain to a federal officer, not just that the book exists, but exactly what it says. I need to read all of it. She looked at Tom. Is there light here that won't be seen from the road? Tom closed the curtain on the one window. He lit a second lamp and moved it to the table. Ruth looked at Holt. He looked at the door, which was bolted, and at the window, which was curtained, and at the shed where the wagon was. We have until the sky starts to gray, he said. After that we are on the road. Ruth reached into her coat and put the green book on the table. She opened it to the first page. It was dated 7 years ago, and the handwriting was consistent all the way through, the careful, precise script of a man who valued accuracy even when accuracy was the record of something he should not have been doing. Or perhaps especially then. Perhaps the care with which he wrote down the true figures was the one place in the operation where his original self, the man who had stood at the riverbank watching everything disappear and decided to never let it disappear again, still fully operated. Ruth read. She read the way she read account books, with the part of her that did not just follow the numbers but constructed the story the numbers were telling. Tom sat across from her and read the pages she turned over, and his face did the thing faces do when confirmation of a long-held truth arrives in a form you can touch. Holt stood at the door with his back to them and listened to the sound of the lamp and the occasional turn of a page, and the growing silence of two people reading something that was larger than they had expected. An hour in, Ruth said, "The Garrett land is in here." Tom did not respond immediately. Then, the figure he collected against what was actually owed. Yes. And a notation about the signature preparation. Tom put both hands flat on the table. He looked at them. "There are 14 other transactions with the same structure," Ruth said. Not gently, she did not manage things away from their true size. She had learned that managing things away from their true size was how you ended up in a courtroom, with a judge who had dinner arrangements with the man who had stolen your family's land. 14 families. Over 7 years. The same method. The same margin notation. The same word collected. The lamp made a small sound. The horses shifted in the shed. Outside, the Montana night was at its deepest, the hour before the sky begins its long decision to become morning. Clara Birch said, "I served those families at his table. He invited them to dinner when he was in the process of taking their land. He poured them wine and he was gracious." She paused. "I carried the wine. Nobody said anything. I carried the wine and I stood in the doorway, and I went back to the kitchen and I told myself I had no choice," Clara said. 14 families. I knew. I did not know the specific figures, but I knew the shape of the thing. I knew every time. She looked at the green book on the table. "Write that down if you write anything down. Put it in whatever statement you make to the federal court. Put down that his housekeeper knew and said nothing for 7 years. Because that is also true, and I am done with only the convenient parts of the truth being told." Ruth looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Clara," and stopped. "Because there are things you cannot say to someone in the language of adequacy," and she knew it, and Clara knew it. And what passed between them in that pause was the understanding of two women who had both spent significant portions of their lives doing what they had to do in rooms where other people made the decisions, and who were both in this dark building at the edge of a county at the darkest part of an October night on the other side of that. By 3 in the morning, Ruth had read the full ledger. She had a clear account in her head of every transaction, 14 families, plus the current claim against Silas Granger's estate, the complete architecture of a 7-year scheme in the hand of its architect, preserved with the ironic thoroughness of a man who trusted no one enough to delegate the counting. Holt said, "We ride in 2 hours. Tom said, "I know a route." "So do I," Holt said. "And we are not going the same way twice." There was a detail that needed addressing, and none of them had addressed it yet, and Holt addressed it now. Clara could not stay in this county. Clara's presence in this county, after tonight, was a danger to her that could not be mitigated by distance alone, because Voss would eventually understand that the only person who could have opened that kitchen door had opened it. And when he understood that, her continued presence in territory he controlled was not survivable. "You come with us," Holt said. Not a suggestion. Clara looked at him. She looked at Ruth. Something in her face had the quality of a door that has been locked for a very long time opening. Not dramatically, but on its actual hinges, which were functional and had been functional the entire time. "All right," she said. 2 hours. Ruth sat with the lamp and the paper she had brought from Stone Ridge Ranch and wrote out what she had read in the ledger in her own hand, not transcription but summary and analysis. The 14 families. The mechanism. The margin annotations. The correlation between the forged Garrett signature and the method used in each of the other cases. She wrote it in the clear, quick script of someone who had been keeping books since she was 12 and understood that the value of a record was not only in its existence but in its accessibility to the reader who had to act on it. Holt went to the shed and checked the horses, and checked the wagon, and checked the false bottom, and stood in the dark of the shed with his hand flat on the wagon board, under which the green book sat, and thought about what comes next, with the specific practicality of a man who has always known that thinking past the immediate problem is how you lose the immediate problem. What came next was a day and a half to the territorial capital. What came next was a federal officer who had not had dinner with Edmund Voss. What came next was Ruth sitting across a table from that officer with the green book and her own notes, and the 30 years of Nora Garrett's handwriting in Tom's coat pocket, and walking that officer through the architecture of a 7-year operation, with the same focused clarity she had brought to a hive box of receipts, and a man who had been paying twice the going rate for winter feed. What came next, if all of that went the way it needed to go, was a warrant. And a warrant from a federal court was not a fence. A fence you could decide to stand behind or not. A warrant was a different order of thing entirely. He went back inside. Ruth looked up from her writing. She looked at him the way she had been looking at him with increasing frequency, since the day with the horses, not the assessing look, not the professional look, but the look that had nothing efficient in it, and that he had been finding increasingly difficult to pretend he did not understand. He sat down across from her. "How much longer?" he said. 20 minutes. Then we have 20 minutes. He folded his hands on the table. "Tell me you are going to be all right." Ruth looked at him steadily. "I am going to be better than all right," she said. "I am going to be the woman who sat across from a federal officer in the territorial capital and walked him through a 7-year fraud in sufficient detail that he had no choice but to act on it. I am going to be the woman who made it possible for 14 families to find out that what was taken from them was taken through a lie." She looked back at her notes. "And then I am going to go home." The word home did the thing in the room that it did, settled into the space between them with the weight of a word that has been used correctly, that has arrived at its right meaning by a path that was not straightforward and is the more accurate for it. He had built Stone Ridge Ranch to be a place that required nothing from anyone. It was going to need to expand its requirements. Tom came back in from a survey of the road and said it was clear for now, and getting clearer would be a matter of leaving before the roads became active. Clara had her coat on. The lamp was still burning, but barely. Ruth finished the last line of her notes. She blotted the page and folded it into the green book and closed the cover. She looked at the 3 people in the room: Tom Garrett, with 4 years of standing at the county line, and 1 precious ledger his mother had kept for 30 years. Clara Birch, with 15 years of knowing and carrying it, and finally, in the middle of an October night, putting it down, and Holt Calloway, who had built his entire life around the proposition that he was done with the kind of loss that came with caring, and who was currently sitting at a table at 3 in the morning in a dark building, having just checked the false bottom of a wagon for the 3rd time. She thought about her father, who had pulled a stranger out of the mud at a river crossing because he couldn't ride past. She thought, "I know exactly why he couldn't." "Let's go," she said, and they went. They rode through what was left of the night, and into the gray that preceded dawn, and through the dawn itself. The 4 of them strung out on the road, in the order that made sense, Tom driving the wagon with Clara on the seat beside him, Holt and Ruth on horseback flanking, close enough to the wagon that the green book under the false bottom was never more than a few yards from at least one of them. The territorial capital was a day and a half at a sustainable pace. They were not at a sustainable pace. They were at the pace of people who understood that the distance between where they were and where they needed to be was measured in something other than miles. Holt chose the roads the way he had chosen the high trail, not the direct route. Not the route a man waiting at a crossroads would predict, but the route that arrived from the unexpected angle. He knew this territory the way a man who has lived at its edge for 11 years knows it, not from maps, but from the accumulated knowledge of having moved through it in all seasons and all weathers, knowing which creek crossings held in October and which did not, which stretches of road ran through land that was somebody's range and would be watched, and which ran through land that was nobody's particular business. They changed horses twice, at stations where Tom had accounts for freight delivery, and where his presence with a loaded wagon was unremarkable. Each time they stopped, Ruth sat in the wagon and did not get out and drew no attention and read the road behind them through the gap in the canvas cover, with the focused attention of someone who has learned that the thing you do not look for is the thing that arrives unexpectedly. Nothing arrived unexpectedly. The road behind them was the road behind them and not anything else, and by the time the second horse change was done, and they were moving again, Holt had calculated that even if Voss had sent men at first light, the men would be on the roads he predicted they would be on. And this road was not one of those roads. Clara Birch sat on the wagon seat with Tom and spoke very little for the first 8 hours. This was not shock. She was not a woman undone by what she had done. She was a woman in the process of understanding what she had done, which was a different and more deliberate thing. Occasionally she would say something, short and specific, a detail about the house or about Voss's operations that had surfaced now, that the decision to stay silent was no longer in effect. Tom received each of these details with the attention of someone assembling something from parts that have been scattered over a long time, each piece clicking into a structure that was becoming more complete with each addition. At midday, they stopped at a creek crossing to water the horses and eat what they had brought. Ruth sat on a flat rock above the creek bank, and Holt sat below her on the bank itself, and they ate in the companionable efficiency of people who have been operating together long enough that meals do not require ceremony. "We will get there tonight," Ruth said. "Late tonight. The federal office will not be open at that hour, no." He looked at the creek. "We will need a place to stay. Tom knows the town. Tom knows every freight stop in the territory." Ruth looked at the road they had come from and then at the road ahead. The territorial capital was not large, but it was the seat of federal authority in the region, and the specific quality of authority it contained was the kind that had been built by people who answered to Washington rather than to the largest landowner in a 3-county radius. That distinction was the entire reason they were making this ride. She thought about the green book in the false bottom of the wagon. She had read it from cover to cover in the dark of Tom's building, and she held it in her head now the way she held all numbers completely, retrievably, in the specific order that made the pattern visible. When she sat across from the federal officer, whoever he was, whatever his particular quality of attention, she would not need the book to be open. She would need the book to exist as physical evidence, but the argument she was going to make would not come from the book. It would come from her account of the book, delivered with the precision that came from understanding not just what the numbers said, but what they could not avoid revealing about the person who had written them. "There is something I keep thinking about," she said. Holt waited. Voss kept that book because he could not stop keeping it. He needed to know the exact figure, the exact accumulated total of what he had rebuilt since the flood took his brother and his cattle and everything he had started with. She watched the creek. He was not keeping it for any practical operational reason. The false books he showed the bank examiner were sufficient for the fraud to function without the green book existing at all. He kept it for himself, because the number in it was the proof that what had been taken from him had been more than replaced. Holt turned this over. "So the thing that convicts him is the thing he kept as his private consolation," he said. "The thing he could not stop counting is the thing that counts him." She stood up from the rock. "There is a justice in that which I find I cannot entirely set aside." They reached the territorial capital at 11 that night. Tom knew a boarding house near the freight depot that asked no questions of people arriving late with a wagon, which was the specific kind of discretion that freight operations tended to cultivate, because freight arrived at all hours and the people accompanying it were not always in a condition to explain themselves at length. They took 2 rooms and put the wagon in the locked shed behind the building, and Clara Birch slept in the first real silence she had known in 15 years, which was to say the silence of a place where Edmund Voss did not exist in any form, not as employer, not as presence, not as the organizing fact of her daily life. Ruth lay awake in the second room, with Holt beside her, and looked at the ceiling of a boarding house in the territorial capital, and thought about what the morning required, which was the most important conversation she had ever had with a person she had never met. Holt was awake too. She could tell from his breathing, which had the quality of attention rather than the quality of sleep. "What is his name?" she said. "The federal marshal. Emmett Hale. He has had the appointment 6 years. He was brought in after there were questions about the previous marshal's relationship with certain land interests in the territory." Holt paused. Which means he was specifically selected, because he did not have those relationships. Good. He will be thorough. He will not take a thing on assertion. I do not intend to ask him to. She thought about what thorough looked like in a room, across from a federal marshal, and she thought about the Green Book and Nora Garrett's 30-year ledger and the letter from Voss with his own name on it claiming a false figure, and she thought, this is what thorough looks like. This is what happens when you bring the right evidence to the right room. She slept eventually. Not long, but enough. In the morning she put on the blue calico that had been her mother's, not because it was her best dress, which it was not, but because it was the dress that belonged to the occasion, in a way she could not entirely articulate, except that she understood that what she was about to do was the culmination of everything that had been set in motion when her father pulled a stranger from a riverbank 9 years ago, and she wanted to be wearing the thing that connected her to the full length of that chain. The federal marshal's office was 2 blocks from the main street in a building that was not impressive but was solid, built from the same red brick as the courthouse, the architecture of federal permanences rather than frontier expediency. Marshal Emmett Hale was at his desk at 7 in the morning, which told Ruth something useful about him, before he had said a word to her. He was 55, gray at the temple, with the build of a man who had spent his working life doing physical things and had not stopped. He looked at the 4 people who came through his door, a woman in a blue calico dress, a man in worn flannel and a trail-dusty vest, a second man with the hands of a freight worker and the eyes of someone carrying a 4-year-old grievance, and a woman in a gray service dress who had the bearing of someone who had just resigned a position she had held under duress, and he said, "Sit down," and reached for a fresh sheet of paper. Ruth sat across the desk from him and put the Green Book on the surface between them. She told him what it was. She told him what was in it. She told him the mechanism, the true figures beside the false ones, the notation system Voss had used, the forged signature in the Garrett case, and the 14 other transactions with the same structural fingerprint. She told him about the letter Voss had sent to Stone Ridge Ranch with his name on it, claiming a debt of $1,100 against a signed note that said $400. She told him what Nora Garrett's 30-year ledger contained, and why it was the specific evidence that unlocked the Garrett case's forgery claim. She told him all of this in order, without repetition, without the kind of emotional emphasis that would have asked him to feel something before he had evaluated the evidence. Because she understood that a federal marshal in a room with a Green Book and a woman explaining it did not need to be told how to feel. He needed to be told the facts in a sequence that made the pattern visible. It took 90 minutes. When she finished, Hale sat back in his chair and looked at the Green Book and then at her. "You went into his house," he said. Not an accusation. The statement of a man, making sure he had the sequence correct. "We did. You removed this book from the premises." "We did." Hale looked at the book for a moment. The admissibility of evidence obtained in this manner is a question that will require attention. "I understand that," Ruth said, "which is why the book is not the only evidence. The book confirms and details the scheme. The forgery in the Garrett case can be demonstrated independently through the comparison of the signature on the note against 30 years of documented signatures in Nora Garrett's own hand. The current claim against my father's estate can be demonstrated through the original note, which Voss himself told my husband was in his office, which means it still exists and can be subpoenaed, and through my husband's testimony about the figure Voss stated aloud versus the figure on the original document." She folded her hands on the desk. "The book is the confirmation. The independent evidence is the foundation. You do not need the book to open the case. You need the book to understand the scope of it once it is open." Hale looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who is recalibrating something. Then he said, "In 30 years I have never seen a man convict himself more thoroughly than Mr. Voss appears to have done." He pulled the Green Book toward him and opened it to the first page. "He did the work for us. He could not stop counting what he had taken," Ruth said. "Men who have lost everything once cannot stop counting what they have replaced it with. The counting was never about the operation. It was about the proof that the flood had not won." Hale looked up at her. "That is an accurate reading of this," he said. "I know." He read for 2 hours. Ruth sat across the desk and answered questions when he had them, and was quiet when he did not, and did not push the pace, because the pace was correct, and pushing it would have disrupted the quality of attention he was giving the material, which was thorough in the specific way she had hoped for. Tom sat in the outer office with Nora's ledger on his knee, and Clara sat beside him, and Holt stood at the window and looked at the street, and thought about the ranch, and the fence that needed no more running, and the horse that had answered its question, and the lean-to that had a finished roof now, and was too small. At noon, Hale put the book down and looked at Ruth. "The warrants," he said, "will take until tomorrow morning to prepare properly. I want them to be unassailable." He paused. "I want Mr. Voss to have no procedural remedy. I want every step of this to be done in a manner that gives him nothing to appeal on technical grounds." "Yes," Ruth said, "that is exactly right. You will stay in the capital until they are prepared. We will stay." Hale looked at the book and then at her. "Your father's note, the original, at $400. It is in Voss's office. He told my husband so directly. When the warrant is executed, that office will be searched. If the note is there, it will be recovered." He paused. "And the difference between 400 and 1100, extracted from a man under federal warrant for systematic land fraud, that is a matter of restitution that the court will address." Ruth said nothing. She looked at the desk surface for a moment. "He had it all in his own handwriting," she said. "Not to Hale specifically. Not to anyone in the room. To the shape of it, the specific shape of a man, who kept such careful record of a life he had built on stolen foundations and had thereby preserved the evidence that would dismantle it. He could not let it go unrecorded. He needed to know the number." "Yes," Hale said. "He needed to know the number." He stood and extended his hand across the desk. "Mrs. Calloway, I will see you in the morning." She shook it. His grip was the grip of a man who had decided something. She walked out of the office and into the street, where Holt was standing at the edge of the boardwalk with his hat in his hands, turning it in the way he turned things when he was waiting for information he could not yet have, and was managing the wait. She said, "Tomorrow morning." He looked at her. "Warrants tomorrow morning," she said. "He wants them unassailable." Holt put his hat back on his head. Something moved through his face that was not entirely about the warrants. "Come here," he said, which was 2 words he had not said to her before in that register, and she went to him there on the boardwalk in the tutorial capital in the blue calico dress, and he put both arms around her and held on, with the specific quality of a man holding something he has been told he is allowed to keep and is still in the early stages of believing it. She put her face against his shoulder, and for one moment she let the last 4 weeks exist in her body. All at once the 40-mile walk and the wedding and the horse and the ledger and Voss in the yard and Thursday night and the dark field and the run to the county road, and then she let it move through, and she breathed in the smell of trail, dust and flannel, and the high country that had settled into him over 11 years, and she thought, this is what home smells like when it is a person. They stayed in the territorial capital 2 days in total. The warrants were prepared by mid-morning of the second day, 3 of them, comprehensive, unassailable in the manner Hale had described, covering the fraud, the forgery, the systematic pattern of falsified instruments across multiple counties and multiple victims. Hale rode out with 6 deputies who answered to federal authority and not to the organizational structure Edmund Voss had spent 20 years building in the valleys below. The news moved the way news moved in that country, which was faster than horses, and through channels that no one could fully account for. By the time the federal party reached Voss Valley 2 days after that, the word had already come. They were coming for Voss. The woman from Stone Ridge Ranch and the mountain man and the freight yard Garrett and the housekeeper, who had walked out of the big house carrying nothing but 15 years of knowledge. They had gone to the federal marshal. They had brought the government with them. Ruth knew this was how it was going before they reached the outskirts of Harrow Creek, because she could see it in the road, in the people who had come out to the edges of their properties, standing at fence lines and on porch steps, watching the road with the particular quality of attention that was not curiosity but something older, the watching of people who have been living under a weight for a long time and are waiting to see whether the weight is actually going to lift, or whether this is the kind of thing that promises to lift and then settles back down heavier than before. Harrow Creek was different from the day she had ridden through it in the blue dress on the way to Reverend Pruitt's. Then the street had given them the attention of a town deciding how much trouble two people were going to bring. Now the street gave them something she did not immediately have a word for. Recognition, maybe. The specific recognition of a town that has been deciding for 20 years what it thought of Edmund Voss and has just been given new information. They passed the general store, and George Bates was on the boardwalk, and he looked at Holt and nodded once. The nod of a man who had spent some of his own safety on a warning 3 weeks ago and was glad it had been spent on something that mattered. They rode through to Voss Valley. The valley was exactly as it had always been: the big house on the rise, the spreading acreage, the cattle that represented the accumulated acquisition of 20 years. But there was a quality to it that was different now, the quality of a landscape that knows it is being looked at differently, that the thing it was organized around is in the process of changing. Edmund Voss was at home. His men were not, or most of them were not. Hale's deputies had moved efficiently, and the specific efficiency of federal process when it is applied without warning to an operation that has always operated on the assumption that it had sufficient warning built into its relationships had produced, over the 2 days since the warrants were issued, the quiet dissolution of the arrangements that had held the valley in a particular shape. The sheriff's office was already addressed. The territorial capital had received communication about the sheriff's specific role in the scheme from a source that had decided, in the immediate aftermath of the warrant being issued, that cooperation was preferable to indictment, and the nature of that communication had resulted in a second set of proceedings that were already in motion. Voss came out of the house when the federal party arrived. He did not come out because he had decided to cooperate. He came out because the alternative was being brought out, and whatever Edmund Voss was, he was not a man who was going to be brought out of his own house if he could walk out of it. He was dressed as he always dressed: the tweed vest, the polished boots, the hat that cost more than most people in the valley earned in a month. He looked at the federal deputies. He looked at Hale. He looked at Tom Garrett, who was standing to the left of the group with his arms at his sides, and the expression of a man who has been waiting 4 years for this exact moment and had promised himself he would not make it anything other than what it was. Then he looked at Ruth. She was standing on the step of his house, the house from which she had taken the green book in the dark of a Thursday night, and she was wearing the same dark calico she had worn that night, and she was looking at him with the patient attention of someone who has spent a very long time being looked at, as though she was a problem to be managed and has resolved to no longer accommodate that interpretation. He stopped in front of her. He could not walk to the federal deputies without stopping in front of her because she was standing between him and them, not deliberately, but by the geography of how the group had arranged itself, and neither of them moved to change it. He looked at her the way a man looks at a miscalculation he cannot account for. "You," he said, one word. Everything in it, the incomprehension, the assessment revised, too late, specific quality of the spent 20 years in a room where he set the terms and is encountering for the first time what it is to be in a room where someone else has set them. "You should have shown my husband the note," Ruth said. Her voice was even, the voice she used for accurate statements. Not cold, not satisfied. True, that was the only mistake. You could not show him $400, so you said $1,100. And a man who will state a lie that size in front of a witness. She paused, not for effect but because the sentence required the pause to land accurately, writes the truth down somewhere, because he cannot stop counting what he has taken. Voss looked at her for a moment longer. In his face was the specific expression of a man understanding a chain of events in reverse, seeing each link for what it was, arriving at the first link and finding it was his own certainty that no one was in a position to use the truth against him. He said nothing else. There was nothing to say that would have been anything other than less than what she had just said, and Edmund Voss was, among other things, a man who understood the value of silence when speech could only worsen the position. Hale moved forward. The deputies moved with him. The process that Hale had described as unassailable proceeded in the specific unassailable manner he had designed, which was to say without drama, without the kind of irregularity that could later be pointed to, with the full weight of federal authority brought to bear on a situation that had for 20 years operated entirely below that Wait. Tom Garrett stood and watched Edmund Voss be led past him in irons, and he did not shout, and he did not gesture, and he did not need to do either of those things. The need to do them had been replaced by something that was not peace, exactly, but was adjacent to it, the state of a man who has waited for a specific thing to happen, and has watched it happen, and finds that the waiting was not wasted, and the thing was worth the waiting. When Voss passed him, Tom looked at him steadily. Voss did not look back. Not from dignity, from the inability to meet the eyes of someone he had wronged completely, and could not now diminish in any of the ways he had previously used to avoid meeting eyes like that. Ruth came to stand beside Tom after they had taken Voss to the federal wagon. Tom said, "My mother kept that ledger 30 years. Every day in the evening, before she slept. She said she did it because she did not trust men to remember a bargain honest." He looked at the drive where the wagon was. She was not wrong. "No," Ruth said. "She was not. She would have liked you." He looked at Ruth briefly. "She would have said you have the right relationship with numbers." Ruth looked at the house. "What is the right relationship with numbers?" She said, "Numbers do not lie, but they do not volunteer. You have to know where to look." He was quiet for a moment, she knew. She just did not have anyone to look with. What came after that took the form that legal proceedings take, which is to say it was slow and thorough, and happened in rooms that Ruth and Holt were not present in, because their part in it had been done in Hale's office with the Green Book, and 90 minutes of explanation. The Federal Circuit Court did what Federal Circuit Courts do when they have the evidence they have been given. They went back through the record. Every foreclosure, every instrument of debt, every signature that was attributed to a hand that had not made it. The Garrett land came back to Tom, not as a gesture, not as a favor, but as a legal finding that it had never legitimately left. Tom Garrett drove up to the edge of his family's land on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after Voss was taken into federal custody, and he sat on the wagon seat. He looked at the ground, that his father had worked for 30 years, and that his mother had recorded every transaction of in a small, careful ledger, and he sat there for a very long time. Then he climbed down from the wagon, and he walked to the middle of the field, and he knelt down, and he put both hands flat on the earth and held them there. Nobody disturbed him. Nobody needed to. Clara Birch received what the federal court determined she was owed for 11 years of service in a house that had been conducting criminal operations throughout her employment, not because she had been complicit, but because the asset recovery from Voss's estate was substantial, and the court was minded to be thorough about where it went. It was enough for a small property on the east edge of the county, far from the valley, with a garden that got afternoon light and a porch from which you could see the mountains. On the day she moved in, she came to Stone Ridge Ranch first. She came in the wagon that Tom had driven for her, and she came to the door of the cabin, and Ruth opened it, and the two women stood in the doorway. In the October light, Clara, in her gray service dress that she was wearing for the last time, because she was going to take it off when she got home and burn it, she had decided, not from anger, but from the practical decision that some things you do not carry forward, and Ruth in the dark calico that had become her working dress. Clara took Ruth's face in both her worn hands, the way you hold something you want to see clearly. "Your father raised a daughter who walks toward a fire when everything in her says run from it," Clara said. Her voice had the specific quality of a woman who has spent 15 years managing her voice carefully and is no longer doing that. "I will be grateful for that the rest of my life. Not for what you did for me, for what you asked me to do for myself." Ruth put her hands over Clara's hands. She did not say "you are welcome" because that was not the right language for what Clara had said. She said, "Come see the horse before you go," because that was the right language. The language of two women who had done something together and were now both, in different ways, on the other side of it, and were beginning to discover what the other side looked like. They went to the paddock, and Silas came to the rail, and Clara put her hand out, and the horse took his time about it. But eventually he reached and touched his nose to her palm, and Clara laughed, a short, surprised laugh, the laugh of a woman rediscovering something she had not expected to find in a paddock on a mountain in October.
Holt paid the $400.
The actual debt, the figure Silas Granger had signed for with his shaking hand and which his daughter had told Holt about, before he had even agreed to any of this, the honest figure, the real one. He paid it into the federal restitution process, because that was where it belonged, now that the process existed, and Ruth did not argue with him about paying it, even though she had intended to pay it herself, because she understood that Holt paying it was his version of settling accounts with Silas Granger, his version of the transaction the old man had set in motion at Dry Fork River 9 years ago. And some things you do not argue a person out of, because the doing of them is the point. She would argue with him about something else later. She had found she was good at it. The ranch itself, Stone Ridge Ranch, the place Holt had built to require nothing from anyone, began to change, in the ways that places change when they stop being arranged around a single person's specific need to remain intact. The lean-to became a room with proper walls, and a proper floor, and a door with a functioning latch. A second room was added to the north side through November, the walls going up in the methodical way Holt built things, each log fitted before the next was placed. Ruth kept the books through all of it, and the books were in better order than they had ever been, and the man from whom Holt had been buying overpriced winter feed received a letter in Ruth's handwriting that was polite in its surface and absolute in its terms, and did not require a response because the alternative supplier's first delivery arrived 3 days after the letter was sent. The horse named Silas continued to be worth more than Holt had been going to sell him for, and continued to be the horse that moved best under Ruth's handling. Holt had accepted this the way he accepted most things about his wife, as an accurate fact about the world that he had not known before she arrived, and that he could not now imagine not knowing. The winter came in early that year the way it came in the high country, without apology. Snow on the peaks, in October on the flats by November, and the ranch sealed itself against it the way a properly built thing seals against weather. Not by pretending the weather was not there, but by being the kind of structure that the weather was required to go around. One evening in early December, Ruth came in from the paddock and found Holt at the table, not doing anything in particular, just sitting with his coffee and looking at the fire in the way he looked at things he was thinking about, rather than things he was seeing. She hung up her coat and sat across from him, and he looked up. "I have been thinking about your father," he said. She waited. At Dry Fork River, when he found me, he turned the coffee cup in his hands. I spent 9 years thinking about what I owed him. 9 years of it sitting in my chest like a stone I could not put down because I could never figure out what payment would actually clear it. Money was not the answer. Time was not the answer. I had no way to give back the 2 days he spent carrying me through hostile country, or the risk he took doing it, or the fact that he did it at all. Ruth looked at him across the table. "And then he sent me a letter," Holt said. "Through you, through 40 miles of road and a bleeding hand and 2 words I had not said out loud in 9 years. And I thought, here is the bill. Here is what 9 years of a debt feels like when it finally arrives in a form I can do something about." He looked at the fire. "It was not a bill," he said. "I understand that now. I have been sitting here trying to find the language for what it actually was, and I have not been able to improve on what seems true, which is that Silas Granger watched a stranger for 9 years because of one moment at a riverbank, and he decided that what he had seen at that moment was worth the most expensive thing he had to spend. He spent it on me." He paused. "A man who was lying in the mud of a river crossing, not knowing if he was going to get up from it." Ruth said nothing for a moment. The fire made its sound. The snow was coming down outside. She could hear it in the particular silence that snow made on the roof. "He saw you take your hat off," she said, "to an empty morning, not knowing anyone was watching." "He saw me take my hat off," Holt agreed. "And he kept that for 9 years, and then he gave it to his daughter as the most valuable thing he had. And his daughter walked 40 miles and put it on my table." He looked at her. "I do not know how a man pays back something like that." Ruth looked at her husband across the table that had started as one man's table and had become 2 people's table, in the cabin that had started as one man's arrangement for not needing anyone, and had become something that had required 2 additional rooms already, and would require, in a matter of months, something more careful to think about. "You stop trying to pay it back," she said. "That is the answer. You stop keeping the ledger because the ledger is the wrong instrument for this particular accounting." She held his gaze with the directness she used for the important things. "My father did not pull you out of that river to create a debt. He did it because he could not ride past. And the reason he could not ride past, the thing that made him stop instead of keeping on, was the same thing that made you take your hat off to an empty morning. You were both the same kind of person. You recognized each other. She paused. You still are the same kind of person. And the way you honor that is not by paying a figure. It is by continuing to be the person he recognized. Holt was quiet for a moment that was not empty, but full in the way the best silences were full. We were both people who thought we had nothing left, he said. He had been dying, and I had arranged myself into a man who had already decided what to be without. And two people who had decided they had nothing left, Ruth said, climbed the same mountain and found out they were wrong. She looked at the fire. He looked at her. The snow came down on Stone Ridge Ranch, and the horses were in, and the new rooms had their doors, and the books were in order for the first time in 11 years, and the December dark held everything in the particular way. The high country dark held things not like a weight but like a frame, defining the edges of what was inside it, so that what was inside it could be seen clearly. There is something I need to tell you, she said. She was still looking at the fire. The way she said it had a quality she did not usually give things, a carefulness about placement, about timing. He waited with his full attention. She looked at him. The firelight on her face and the specific composure that was not about being composed, but about having decided what she was going to say and being ready to say it. We are going to need the second new room, she said. The one you finished last week. We are going to need it to be something specific. She held his eyes. By spring. The fire made it sound. The snow made it sound. Holt Calloway sat across from his wife in the home he had built to require nothing and looked at her face in the firelight and understood what she had just told him and sat with the understanding for a moment in which the last remaining wall, the one so interior, he had not even known it was still standing. The one that had been there since a November night 11 years ago, when a doctor had come out of a room and taken his hat off, came down, not with grief. Not with the particular terror he had been managing against for 11 years. With something that was entirely different. With something that was entirely different and that he had no practiced relationship with and that arrived complete and fully formed in his chest like a thing that had been waiting for exactly this room to exist before it could enter it. He reached across the table and took her hand. Not the brief firm grip of the wedding day. Not the 40 feet behind you grip of a Thursday night field. The grip of a man who has been given something he did not know he was still capable of wanting and who is not, this time, going to arrange himself against it. Spring, he said. Spring, she said. Outside, the snow continued its work on the mountain, with the patient thoroughness of something that has been doing this particular job for a very long time and does not need to be remarkable about it. The peaks were white to the tree line. The sage was buried. The trail that Ruth had come down 40 miles ago was under a foot of snow and would stay that way until the season turned, and when the season turned, the high country would open again the way it always opened, not gradually but decisively, the snow pulling back up the peaks as the warmth came in, the sage emerging, the grass coming in green where the white had been, and in the paddock below the cabin, the horse named Silas stood in the covered portion of the enclosure and was comfortable, which was a different thing from what he had been before, and required no further explanation.